My name is Daniel Mercer, and I was never the kind of man who put much stock in ghost stories. I grew up in a small town in rural Virginia, where every back road and every mountain hollow had some tale of witches or spirits tied to it. Most of the people I knew seemed to relish telling those stories, as if sharing them somehow gave a sense of ownership over the fear that ran through them. I was different. I believed in what I could touch, in what I could see with my own eyes. Anything else I chalked up to imagination, exaggeration, or superstition passed down so many times that the details had warped into something unrecognizable. I tell you this not to convince you of my rationality, but to emphasize the weight of what happened to me and why I will never again dismiss the stories people share about places that carry darkness. The cabin in question was nothing more than a crude hunting shack tucked deep into the Blue Ridge Mountains. It belonged to a family friend, though I had never seen it before that night. Its reputation, however, I had heard whispered since I was a boy. People said strange things happened there. Objects moving, footsteps in empty rooms, voices murmuring through thin walls. Hunters who stayed overnight claimed they never returned to the place again, and locals swore the land itself resisted being settled. I had always rolled my eyes at these accounts. A drafty old shack with creaking boards could explain footsteps. Wind whistling through gaps in the timber could sound like voices. Fear was a powerful thing, and when you slept in the woods, every sound grew teeth. But life has a way of testing disbelief. One autumn evening, after my truck broke down on a remote road, and the sun began its swift descent behind the ridges, I found myself without options. I had been on my way to visit my cousin in a neighboring county, planning to spend the weekend hiking and catching up. When the engine gave out, the cell signal was long gone, and I was left staring at the miles of shadowy forest around me. I knew the cabin was close. A man named Harold, who used to hunt with my father, had mentioned it was less than 2 miles off the road where my truck sputtered to its death. With darkness closing in, and no chance of help until morning, I had a choice. Spend the night in the open, or take my chances with the cabin. The air had that sharp October bite, heavy with the scent of fallen leaves beginning to rot. Coyotes yipped in the distance, and the forest seemed to grow thicker as night crept in. I shouldered my pack, locked the truck as though that would matter, and followed the barely visible trail into the woods. Every step carried me deeper into silence broken only by my breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. My flashlight beam wavered across tree trunks, catching glimpses of twisted branches and the glint of animal eyes retreating into darkness. I tried not to think about the stories I had heard. When the cabin finally appeared, it did so suddenly, as though the trees had been holding it back until the last possible second. It was small, no more than one room with a slanted roof, its weathered boards silvered with age. The windows were black and uninviting, and the door leaned slightly off its hinges. I paused at the edge of the clearing, the beam of my flashlight resting on the structure, and for the first time that evening, unease took root in my chest. It looked less like a place built for shelter, and more like something abandoned by the living, left as a marker of something that had passed long ago. Still, the cold and fatigue pushed me forward. The door groaned when I pressed it open, the sound echoing into the hollow room. Dust drifted in the beam of my light, and the smell was one of mildew old smoke and something faintly metallic. Inside, there was a cot pushed against the far wall, a small iron stove with a cracked pipe, and a table scarred by years of use. Someone had left behind a rusted lantern, though I had no oil to feed it. The place was bare, but it would do. I set my pack down on the table, forcing myself to focus on the practical, unroll my sleeping bag, check for leaks in the roof, make sure the door could close against the night. It was only after I settled in that the quiet pressed itself against me in a way that felt unnatural. The woods, so full of sound during my walk, now seemed utterly still. No wind stirred the trees. No insects hummed. It was as though the forest itself held its breath around the cabin. I told myself it was just my imagination, the exhaustion of the long day and the disorientation of being somewhere unfamiliar. I had a tendency to overthink when I was tired. That was all. I lay back on the cot, my hands folded over my chest, staring at the shadows the flashlight threw against the ceiling. The boards creaked occasionally as the structure settled, and I tried to focus on those sounds, grounding myself in what was real. Yet beneath the creaks, I began to notice something else. At first it was faint, like the memory of a sound, the way you sometimes think you hear your name in a crowd. Then it grew clearer, a slow, steady rhythm, like footsteps pacing just outside the cabin. I froze. My first thought was that another traveler had stumbled upon the place, maybe another stranded soul looking for shelter. But the footsteps didn't approach the door. They circled the cabin, crunching through the leaves, dragging slightly as though the walker's feet were heavy. Around and around they went, never pausing, never retreating. My pulse thudded in my ears, and I forced myself to sit up, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. "Hello." My voice cracked in the silence. "There's someone out there." The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise. I waited, my breath shallow, my eyes fixed on the door. Then, slowly, the footsteps resumed, but this time they were inside. I swept the flashlight across the room, the beam darting from wall to wall. Nothing. The cot, the table, the stove, empty. Yet the sound was unmistakable, pressing into the floorboards as though someone were walking just beyond the reach of the light. I stood, the beam trembling in my hand, and the footsteps stopped again. I told myself I was overtired, that the sound was the cabin settling in the cool night air. But even as I tried to reason it away, I felt the undeniable weight of being watched. The air was thicker now, harder to draw into my lungs. My skin prickled as though unseen eyes lingered on every movement. For the next hour, I sat on the cot, flashlight pointed toward the center of the room, refusing to blink. Every creak set my nerves on edge. At some point, exhaustion began to override fear, and my eyelids drooped despite the adrenaline coursing through me. I told myself I would just close my eyes for a moment, just long enough to steady myself. When I woke, the flashlight had died, leaving me in complete darkness. My heart slammed against my ribs as I fumbled for my pack, digging out fresh batteries with shaking hands. The silence was absolute, suffocating. Then, as the light flickered back to life, I saw the door was open. I was certain I had shut it. Positive. Now it gaped into the night, the clearing beyond swallowed by shadows. Cold air poured inside, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something else, something acrid that caught in the back of my throat. I forced myself to stand, to walk to the door and push it closed again, the hinges screaming in protest. My hand lingered on the latch, as though expecting it to resist. When it clicked into place, I stepped back, my entire body trembling. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat with my back against the wall, flashlight in one hand, a pocket knife in the other, straining to hear any sound. The night stretched on endlessly, every minute a lifetime. At some point, I realized the pacing footsteps had returned, but this time they weren't circling outside. They were directly above me, moving back and forth across the roof. The cabin had no second floor. I cannot fully explain the dread that consumed me in that moment. It was not the kind of fear that makes you run. It was the kind that freezes you in place, that convinces you even breathing too loudly will draw attention you cannot survive. I pressed my back harder against the wall, staring upward as though the weight of my gaze could keep whatever it was from breaking through the boards. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, methodical and unhurried. Then, without warning, they stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. I strained to hear, to know where it had gone, but there was nothing. And then, from the corner of the room, came the sound of breathing. It was slow, ragged, and so close I swore I could feel the exhale brush my skin. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, the beam slicing through empty air, illuminating only dust motes drifting lazily. Yet the breathing remained, moving slightly, as though circling me in the dark. My resolve broke. I shouted, my voice hoarse, demanding that whatever was there show itself. The breathing stopped, cut off as though a hand had smothered it. For several long minutes, the cabin was silent again, and I almost convinced myself it had gone. Then, slowly, the door creaked open once more, inch by inch, though I had latched it firmly. This time, I didn't move to close it. I couldn't. My body refused to obey. I sat frozen, watching as the door swung wider, the darkness outside spilling in like ink. The forest remained utterly still, no wind, no sound, only that gaping blackness waiting just beyond the threshold. I do not remember when or how the night finally ended. At some point, exhaustion must have dragged me into unconsciousness despite the terror. When the first light of dawn filtered through the cracked windows, I awoke slumped against the wall, the flashlight still clutched in my stiff fingers. The door was closed again. Relief surged through me, but it was short-lived. Scratched into the wood of the table, deep and fresh, were words that had not been there before. LEAV, morning light should have brought relief, but it only made the room look worse. The pale gray beams creeping through the cracked boards exposed how filthy the place really was. Mildew spreading in dark blooms across the walls, cobwebs thick in every corner, and the floor warped with age. My eyes returned again and again to the word gouged into the table, LEV. The letters were jagged raw, as if carved in haste by something that didn't care about neatness, only about the urgency of the message. For several minutes, I stared at it, waiting for some trick of light to reveal that had always been there and I had simply missed it. The grooves were sharp and fresh, the wood pale where it had been cut, untouched by dust. I touched one of the letters with my fingertip. The edges were rough, splintering into my skin. This wasn't old. This had been made during the night, sometime after I had closed my eyes. I packed quickly, throwing my sleeping bag into my pack without bothering to roll it. My only thought was to get out, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this cabin. But when I reached for the door, my chest tightened. The latch lifted easily, the hinges groaned, and the door swung open. The clearing lay before me, damp with morning mist. Yet as I stepped toward it, something made me hesitate. The forest did not look right. The trees leaned in strange ways, their trunks twisted as though they had grown in pain. The mist curled low to the ground, thick enough to obscure the path, and in the silence I could hear what I swore was faint whispering. Just out of range, but enough to prickle the back of my neck. I stepped back inside and slammed the door shut. My rational mind screamed that I was being foolish, that mist and silence were nothing unusual in mountain woods, that I was inventing threats because of exhaustion. Yet every instinct in me warned that stepping into that fog would be a mistake. So I waited. I sat on the edge of the cot, breathing hard, watching the door as though something might push it open again. Time moved strangely. Minutes felt like hours. The daylight shifted from gray to pale gold, but the mist outside did not lift. Hunger gnawed at me, but the thought of eating in that cabin, of doing anything so normal, while the carved word burned into my mind, turned my stomach. By noon, I could no longer stand the waiting. I slung my pack over my shoulder, tightened my grip on the flashlight though the sun was high, and opened the door again. The mist still hung thick, curling in the clearing like smoke. I forced myself forward, one step, then another, until I was swallowed by it. The trail should have been easy to find. I had followed it just the night before. But as I pushed through the fog, the woods twisted into unfamiliar shapes. The trees grew closer together, their bark slick with moisture. I walked for what felt like an hour, turning in circles, trying to orient myself by the slope of the ground or the angle of the sun, but nothing made sense. Every direction looked the same. Every sound I made seemed swallowed by the mist, as if the forest itself refused to acknowledge my presence. Panic rose quickly. My chest tightened. My legs ached from stumbling over roots hidden in the fog, and my breath came in ragged bursts. I called out once, just to hear a human voice, but the sound echoed back strangely distorted, as though someone else had spoken my words in mockery. That was the moment I knew I couldn't keep wandering. I had no choice but to return to the cabin. Finding it again should have been impossible, but within minutes, the clearing opened before me. The cabin loomed just as it had before, squat and unwelcoming, its boards gray against the pale mist. Relief should have come. Instead, dread settled deeper in my gut. The place hadn't let me go. Inside, the air was colder than it should have been. I dropped my pack and leaned against the wall, sweat cooling on my skin, trying to slow my breathing. The carved word on the table seemed deeper now, as though the grooves had widened on their own. I turned away from it, refusing to look. That afternoon stretched endlessly. I paced the small room, sat on the cot, stood at the window staring into the shifting fog. At times I thought I saw shapes moving within it. Tall, thin figures that lingered just beyond clarity. When I blinked, they were gone. When I pressed my ear to the wall, I thought I could hear them whispering, a faint susurrus that never resolved into words. As the sun dipped low again, fear became something heavier, almost physical. My body ached with it, my stomach churned. I considered trying again to leave, but I knew somehow it wouldn't matter. The forest had bent itself around me, and the cabin would not release me. The best I could do was survive the night. Darkness fell faster than it should have. One moment the clearing glowed with the last light of day. The next it was swallowed by shadow. I fumbled with the flashlight, my hands shaking as I switched it on, the beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the gloom. That was when the knocking began. At first it was soft, a single rap against the wall near the stove, then another closer to the window, then another right by the door, each knock distinct, measured, as though whatever was outside was circling again, testing the boundaries of the cabin. My breath hitched. The sound continued, moving from one side of the shack to the other, methodical and deliberate. I shouted again, though I don't remember what I said. Something about leaving me alone, about not being afraid. The words felt hollow, brittle as the boards surrounding me. The knocking paused, and for a heartbeat the silence returned. Then came the scratching. It started at the door, long, slow drags of something sharp across the wood. The sound crawled down my spine, setting every nerve on edge. The scratches moved higher, then lower, as if claws were testing the door's strength. My light shook wildly as I pointed it toward the sound, but the door remained still. When I reached out to touch it, the scratching stopped. That was when I realized it wasn't only the door. The sound came from the walls too, faint at first, then growing louder. All around me, invisible claws raked against the boards, enclosing me in a cocoon of noise. The air vibrated with it, a maddening chorus that built until I clapped my hands over my ears. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. My own heartbeat sounded deafening. From the corner of the room came the whispering again. This time it was louder, more distinct, though still impossible to make out. I turned the flashlight toward the sound. Dust motes danced in the beam, but the corner was empty. Still, the whispering grew, layering upon itself until it seemed dozens of voices pressed against my skull. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, rocking back and forth with the light clutched to my chest. "Stop," I begged, though I knew they wouldn't. The voices fell silent only when the temperature plummeted. My breath clouded before me, frost gathering on the edge of the table, where the word Liev seemed to glow faintly in the beam of the light. And then, as if mocking me, a new word carved itself into the wood right before my eyes. Sty. The letters cut themselves deep into the surface with a sound like tearing flesh. Though no hand or tool moved across it, I watched, paralyzed, as the grooves deepened and widened, flakes of wood scattering onto the floor. When it was finished, the word sat beneath the first, contradicting it, trapping me between commands. I cannot explain the despair that settled over me then. To leave was impossible. To stay was unbearable. I was caught in something far older and crueler than I could understand, something that fed on fear and confusion. The night stretched on, a blur of sound and silence, whispers and scratching. At times I thought I heard laughter, high and thin, like children playing in the distance. At others, I swore I saw shadows shifting across the floor, though nothing blocked the beam of my light. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. My body refused rest, every muscle locked in terror. When dawn came again, it was weak, gray, and offered no comfort. The mist still clung to the clearing. My hands shook violently as I tried to eat a granola bar from my pack, but the taste turned to ash in my mouth. I spat it out, my stomach heaving. I thought of smashing the table, destroying the words carved into it, but something stopped me. The idea filled me with a dread deeper than anything I had felt before, as if breaking the table would unleash something worse. So I left it untouched. The twin commands burned into my vision. By mid-morning, exhaustion overcame me. My eyelids drooped despite my efforts, and I drifted into a restless half-sleep on the cot. Dreams, or something like them, came quickly. In them, I saw the forest alive with figures, tall and skeletal, their faces hidden in shadow. They moved silently through the trees, circling the cabin, always circling. One of them stepped closer, its hand stretching toward me, fingers impossibly long. When they brushed my chest, I jolted awake, gasping, my shirt damp with sweat. The cabin was silent again, but I knew I wasn't alone. The air felt occupied, heavy with presence. I sat there for hours, listening, waiting, caught between the urge to run and the certainty that running would only lead me back to the same place. As the second night approached, I realized something terrible. The cabin wasn't just haunted, it was alive. Alive. That word would not leave me. The cabin breathed in its own way. The walls shifted as though listening. The floor vibrated faintly beneath my boots when I paced, not from my weight, but from something deeper, as if the earth itself pulsed upward through the timbers. By evening, I stopped trying to deny it. Every rational explanation I had clung to in the first 24 hours had slipped away. Whatever this place was, it was not inert. It was aware. The second sunset bled through the mist in sickly hues, orange fading into bruised purple before darkness swallowed everything. I lit the flashlight again and placed it on the table so its beam washed across the far wall, though the glow only emphasized the carved words. Liev above, Stala below. They seemed to throb faintly, as if reacting to the light. My skin crawled every time my eyes returned to them, so I forced myself to look anywhere else. The cabin smelled different now. Less of mildew and dust, more of something sore, metallic, faintly sweet in a rotting way. It reminded me of a slaughterhouse I had walked past once as a teenager, where the air carried both blood and decay. The odor clung to my throat, making every breath thick and heavy. I tried again to eat but couldn't force food down. My body trembled with fatigue, but fear kept me alert, twitching at every sound. The scratching began earlier this night, before the sun had even fully set. At first soft, tentative, as if testing whether I would respond. Then louder, faster, until it sounded like dozens of claws raking the cabin all at once. I covered my ears, but it was useless. The noise seemed to come from inside my skull. I shouted again, not with bravado this time, but desperation. "What do you want from me?" My voice cracked, breaking under the weight of terror. The scratching stopped instantly. The silence that followed pressed down on me like a physical weight. And then, from directly behind me, came the answer. A whisper. One word, drawn out in a voice dry and brittle as leaves. "You." I spun, the flashlight beam cutting across the cabin, but the space was empty. My pulse hammered so hard I could barely see. The single word echoed in my mind until it wasn't just memory. It was repetition, dozens of voices overlapping, hissing the same word from every shadow. "You, you, you." My legs gave out and I sank to the floor, pressing my back to the cot. The light shook wildly in my hand, darting across the room. For a moment, the beam landed on something in the corner near the stove. Something tall and thin, leaning forward as though stepping out of the darkness. I blinked and it was gone, but the impression of it seared itself into my vision. Limbs too long, shoulders hunched, a head that tilted unnaturally to the side. The whispers subsided, replaced by a low moan that seemed to seep from the very walls. The floorboards vibrated under me, and the table rattled against the uneven ground. The carved words appeared deeper still, the grooves dark as if filled with blood. I couldn't tear my eyes away. Suddenly the flashlight went out. Darkness swallowed everything, thicker than any night I had known. My shaking fingers fumbled with the batteries, but before I could replace them, the room changed. I didn't see it. I felt it. The air shifted, heavy with presence. The breathing returned slow and ragged, moving around me in the dark. I squeezed my eyes shut, but that only made it worse. With sight gone, every other sense sharpened. The floor creaked beside me, boards groaning under weight. The sound of knuckles, or claws, dragged across the cot fabric inches from my shoulder. I could smell the stench of decay more strongly now, as though something stood directly over me. I forced the flashlight on, its beam flickering before it steadied. Nothing. The room was empty, but the cot bore marks now. Thin slashes across the fabric, fresh and raw. My chest seized, breath coming in panicked gasps. I backed into the far corner, light fixed on the cot, unwilling to let the shadows reclaim it. The hours crawled. Time lost meaning. At moments I swore the walls moved closer, the cabin shrinking around me. At others, the ceiling seemed to stretch upward, vanishing into blackness no light could pierce. My sanity frayed at the edges, held together only by the trembling beam of my flashlight. Then, sometime past midnight, the door opened. It didn't creak this time. It swung wide in silence, revealing the clearing beyond, but the clearing wasn't as I remembered. The mist was gone. In its place stretched a forest I had never seen before. The trees were skeletal, branches stripped bare, bark pale as bone. The sky above them glowed a sickly green, no moon, no stars. I stared, transfixed. The beam of my flashlight lost against that alien light, and standing just beyond the threshold was the figure. Tall, impossibly thin, its limbs crooked at unnatural angles. Its head tilted as though its neck couldn't support the weight. The face, if it had one, was shadowed, features shifting when I tried to focus. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there watching. My body refused to obey when my mind screamed to slam the door. I was caught paralyzed, heart hammering. Finally, with a burst of desperate will, I lunged forward and shoved the door shut. The latch clicked into place, and I stumbled back, gasping. But even with the door closed, the air inside remained wrong, colder, heavier, filled with the sense that the figure hadn't been kept out at all. I whispered to myself, over and over, "It isn't real. It isn't real." But I knew better. The whispers returned, closer now, directly in my ears, though no mouth spoke them. They carried fragments of sentences I couldn't piece together, words twisted and layered. But one phrase cut through clearly: "You belong." The floor shook violently then, the table crashing onto its side, splinters flying. The cot slid across the room as though shoved by unseen hands. My pack burst open, contents spilling, scattering as if some wild wind had swept through, though the air was still. The flashlight beam wavered as the entire cabin seemed to convulse, boards groaning and cracking. I thought the place would collapse. Then everything stopped. I stood alone in the center of the cabin, my belongings strewn across the floor, the table overturned, the cot ruined. The silence pressed in, thicker than before. My breathing sounded too loud, obscene in the hush. And then I saw them. In the far corner, where shadow clung deepest, stood not one figure but many. Tall, thin shapes, their outlines flickering as though not fully solid. They didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood shoulder to shoulder, faces lost in darkness. My throat closed. I tried to raise the flashlight higher, but my arm shook too violently. The beam caught glimpses, elongated fingers, hollow sockets where eyes should be, mouths stretched wide in soundless screams. I stumbled back, my heel catching on my spilled gear, and fell hard against the floor. The light tumbled from my grasp, rolling until it pointed upward, casting the ceiling in a cone of trembling brightness. The figures remained in shadow, untouched by the beam, as though the light refused to touch them. I crawled backward until my spine hit the wall. The figures remained still, but the whispering grew louder, rising into a chorus that filled every inch of the room. Words overlapped, fragments bleeding into one another, until they became meaningless noise. I pressed my palms to my ears, but the sound vibrated through my bones. My vision blurred, tears streaming. I shouted, screamed, begged them to stop. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The corner stood empty, the whispers cut off mid-syllable. Only silence remained. My chest heaved, lungs burning as though I had run for miles. My eyes darted across the room, desperate to catch any movement, but there was nothing. The cabin looked almost normal again, though destroyed by the chaos of moments before. But I was not normal. Something inside me had broken. I could feel it. A fracture in the part of me that believed in safety, in reason, in the stability of the world. That fracture widened with each passing second, and I knew no matter what happened next, I would never be the same. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the corner, flashlight in hand, whispering prayers I hadn't spoken since childhood. My voice shook, but I clung to each word like a lifeline. The cabin listened. I could feel it. The boards beneath me seemed to pulse faintly in rhythm with my words, as though mocking or echoing them. When dawn finally came, pale and weak through the slats, I didn't move. My body ached from stillness, my throat raw from whispered pleas, but I stayed frozen. I expected relief, sunlight burning away shadows, but the day brought no comfort. The mist had returned outside, thicker than ever, and etched into the wall now, just above where I sat, were new words var. I stared at them until my vision blurred, until I wondered if I had carved them myself, in some fugue of madness. But the grooves were too deep, too deliberate. I reached out with trembling fingers and traced the letters, feeling the rough edges, the fresh splinters. No, it wasn't my hand that had done this. It was the cabin. Something inside me cracked further then, not just fear but despair. I realized I might never leave this place. The cabin didn't just want me for the night. It wanted me completely. The word Fa'arvar burned itself into my mind long after my fingers left the grooves. I sat there with my back to the wall, numb, unable to decide whether to laugh or scream. The cabin had made its intention clear. Whatever was here wasn't satisfied with tormenting me through the night. It wanted permanence. But even as despair coiled around me, another thought pressed in harder. If I stayed, I would be consumed. I could already feel pieces of myself slipping away. My hunger was gone, my sense of time shredded, my thoughts looping endlessly. I was unraveling. If I didn't try again to escape, soon there might be nothing left of me to even attempt it. By mid-morning, I forced myself to gather what little remained of my strength. My pack was torn, but I stuffed what I could inside: water bottle, spare batteries, the flashlight though it flickered, my knife. I left the rest. The carved words glared at me from the walls and table, but I refused to look at them again. If the cabin wanted to keep me, it would have to chase me. When I opened the door, the mist hit me like a solid wall. It curled into the cabin, cold and damp, clinging to my skin. My breath came in sharp bursts, but I stepped forward anyway. The clearing disappeared after only a few paces, swallowed in the thick, gray haze. I told myself I wouldn't stop moving until I found the road. I repeated it like a mantra: don't stop, don't look back, don't listen. The mist distorted everything. Shapes loomed where there should have been trees, twisting into angles that made no sense. My footsteps sounded muted, muffled as if I walked through cloth. At times I thought I heard rushing water, though no streams ran near the cabin. Other times I swore I heard my own voice calling from ahead, begging me to follow. I clenched my jaw, ignored it, pressed on. Minutes blurred into hours. My legs ached, my throat burned from breathing the damp air. Still no road, no familiar landmarks, nothing but endless gray. Panic gnawed at me, but I shoved it down. I had to believe that if I kept walking, eventually I would find something. Then the fog shifted. A darker shape emerged ahead, tall and narrow. My heart leapt, convinced it was a tree I recognized. But as I approached, the shape clarified into something else. A figure. Tall, skeletal, its limbs crooked. The same one I had seen in the doorway the night before. It stood perfectly still, head tilted, watching. I froze, my stomach dropping into ice. Slowly, I took a step backward. The figure didn't move. Its outline blurred slightly in the mist, like smoke struggling to hold form. Then another figure appeared to its left. Then another to its right. And another. Within moments, the mist was full of them, dozens, maybe hundreds, surrounding me in every direction. Silent, unmoving, watching. My body went cold. I spun in circles, searching for an opening. But wherever I turned, they were there, stretching into the fog, shoulder to shoulder, a wall of impossible shapes. My chest heaved, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. For a moment I considered running headlong into them, trying to push through, but every instinct screamed that to touch them would mean something worse than death. Then, as though responding to my fear, they began to move. Not closer, not yet, but swaying. All of them, in perfect unison, rocking side to side like trees in a wind that didn't exist. The sight shattered something inside me. I stumbled backward until my legs buckled, and I fell to my knees. That was when the whispering returned. Not faint this time, not half-heard. Loud. Clear. The voices came from the figures themselves, overlapping, weaving into a chorus that filled the air. You belong. You stay. You forever. The words layered, repeated, twisting into chants. My hands clamped over my ears, but it did nothing. The voices vibrated through the mist, through my bones, through my skull. My vision blurred, spots dancing before my eyes. I screamed, though my voice was swallowed by theirs. I don't know how long it lasted. Seconds, minutes, hours. When the chanting finally ceased, I was lying face down in the wet leaves, shaking violently, throat raw. I lifted my head, desperate to see if they were gone. The mist had thinned. The figures were still there, but farther away now, retreating into the fog. I staggered to my feet, dizzy, clinging to the hope that maybe I had broken free of their circle. I turned, searching for direction, and my stomach dropped. The cabin stood behind me, not miles away, not hidden, but only a dozen steps back, squatting in the mist as if it had followed me. My legs nearly gave out again. I had walked for hours. I had pushed until my body was raw, and yet here it was, waiting. A sob tore out of me, ragged and broken. I slammed my fists against my skull, desperate to wake from what had to be a nightmare, but the sting of pain reminded me it was all real. My choices narrowed to two: collapse here in the fog until whatever those figures were closed in on me, or return to the cabin. Neither was survival, but one at least offered walls. I stumbled back inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the mist seemed to retreat, curling back from the door as though satisfied. I collapsed onto the cot frame, burying my face in my hands, weeping until nothing came out but dry heaves. When I lifted my head, new words were carved into the wall above the table. S-U-U. Rage flared, sharp and bitter. I threw the overturned table against the wall, sending splinters flying, screaming until my throat tore. I shouted at the walls, at the words, at the unseen watchers. Why me? What do you want? Why won't you let me go? The cabin answered. The floor trembled, boards rattling beneath me. The stove door flew open with a metallic bang, belching a gust of air that smelled like charred flesh. The cot collapsed under me as its frame splintered, and from every wall, deep groans vibrated, voices too low to be human. Through the chaos, one phrase formed clearly, spoken by dozens of voices at once. You already ours. The walls shuddered, and for a moment I thought they would close impel. But instead, they stretched outward, bending unnaturally. The cabin grew larger, the ceiling rising into darkness, the corners pulling away until the room became a cavern of shifting shadow. My flashlight beam was swallowed almost instantly, useless against the immensity. Shapes moved in the new darkness. Not just the tall, skeletal figures, but smaller ones too, hunched, crawling, skittering along the edges of my vision. Their eyes glowed faintly, pinpricks of sickly yellow light. My stomach turned as I realized the cabin hadn't just trapped me. It had opened a door, and something was coming through. The whispers rose again, louder, surrounding me in a storm of sound. I stumbled backward until I hit what should have been the wall, but my hand pressed into something soft and wet instead of wood. I yanked it back with a cry, my palm coated in a dark, sticky substance that smelled of iron. I turned and ran. There was no thought, only raw instinct. I sprinted toward the doorway, though it seemed impossibly far now, shrinking into a pinpoint of light. The whispers swelled, the shapes closing in. I could feel hands brushing against me, claws grazing my arms and legs, but I didn't stop. I hurled myself forward, crashing through the doorway into blinding gray mist. I fell hard onto the ground outside, the breath knocked from my lungs. When I looked back, the cabin stood as it always had, small, one room, silent. The door hung slightly open, darkness yawning within. I crawled away, every muscle trembling, eyes fixed on the cabin as though expecting it to lunge after me. But it didn't move. It simply waited. The mist curled thicker again, hiding the trees, swallowing the clearing. I clutched the flashlight, though the beam was weak, and forced myself to crawl farther into the fog. My body screamed for rest, but terror kept me moving. I had escaped the cabin, at least for now, but I knew the truth. I hadn't left it behind. It was inside me now. Every whisper still echoed in my skull. Every shadow seemed to lean closer when I blinked. The word Farvar branded itself behind my eyes, no matter how hard I tried to shake it. The cabin had made its claim, and I was not free. Not really. The fog closed around me, and I kept crawling, then stumbling, then forcing myself into something like walking. Every step felt useless, every direction identical. My body throbbed with exhaustion, my throat raw from screaming, my chest tight with the weight of despair. Yet I couldn't stop. If I stopped, I knew the figures would gather again, swaying in the mist, chanting me into madness. I don't know how long I wandered. Time had dissolved into something meaningless. Sometimes the mist thinned, and I thought I glimpsed shapes of roads, fences, even a lamppost. I would rush toward them, hope surging like fire, only for the vision to dissolve back into endless gray there. Times the mist grew so thick I couldn't see my own hands, and the silence pressed against me until my own heartbeat felt like a violation. At one point I collapsed to my knees, body shaking, tears streaming silently. I whispered to no one, "Please, just let me go." My voice was so faint I wasn't sure I had spoken at all. The fog seemed to ripple in answer, shifting in ways that felt deliberate. Through the haze, the cabin appeared again. I let out a broken laugh. It was everywhere, always waiting. No matter how far I walked, no matter how I fought, it found me. The squat shape stood 30 feet ahead, door ajar, darkness yawning inside. The mist curled lovingly around it, parting as if in reverence. Something inside me cracked for good then. Rage, grief, terror, they all collapsed into numbness. I couldn't escape. I couldn't fight. The only choice left was whether I would go willingly or be dragged. And I couldn't bear the thought of their hands on me again, their whispers crawling into my bones. So I staggered forward on trembling legs and stepped back inside. The door closed behind me without a sound. The cabin was different now. Larger again, but not cavernous like before. The walls leaned closer, pulsing faintly as though breathing. The carved words remained, but more had joined them, covering every surface. Stie, Bielange Ours Farvar, etched so deep the boards looked like open wounds. The air was heavy, almost liquid, pressing into my lungs with each breath. My flashlight flickered, then died completely. Darkness swallowed me whole. But I wasn't blind. Not anymore. My eyes adjusted quickly, though no light existed. I could see shapes moving within the black, flickering forms that leaned from the walls and ceiling. Their faces glowed faintly, pale and twisted, hollow-eyed. The tall figures emerged from the corners, limbs stretching unnaturally, swaying in unison. They surrounded me, silent this time, watching, waiting. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My throat locked, my chest heaving in shallow gasps. I backed against the wall, but the wood was soft again, damp, pulsing faintly like flesh. It quivered beneath my hands. The figures leaned closer. One of them broke from the circle. It stepped forward, towering over me, its head tilting until its hollow face was inches from mine. The air grew colder, my breath fogging between us. Slowly, it lifted a hand, fingers impossibly long, and pressed it against my chest. The moment it touched me, the whispers returned, not in the air this time, but inside my skull. Thousands of voices, all at once, filling every crevice of thought. They weren't words anymore, not exactly. They were commands, truths, inevitabilities. I didn't just hear them. I understood them. They weren't trapping me in the cabin. They were making me part of it. The realization tore through me with unbearable clarity. The figures weren't visitors or intruders. They were what remained of others before me. Hunters, travelers, the unlucky who had stumbled into this place and never walked away. They hadn't been killed. They had been absorbed. Their fear, their flesh, their souls had become the boards, the whispers, the shadows. The cabin wasn't haunted by them. The cabin was them, and now it wanted me to join. I thrashed, screaming wordless defiance, shoving the figure back with every ounce of strength I had. My body reacted with desperation. even as my mind collapsed under the weight of their truth. For a moment the whispers faltered, the figures swaying as if surprised. I bolted for the door, my only thought escape, escape, escape. But when I yanked it open, there was no clearing, no forest, no mist. Only blackness stretched beyond, infinite and empty. I staggered back, stomach twisting, realizing there was no outside anymore. The cabin had swallowed everything. The world I knew was gone. The figures advanced again, patient, certain. I backed into the center of the room, knife trembling in my hand. My last pathetic weapon. My last shred of will. The voices surged, overlapping in a roar that shook the floor. I clapped my hands over my ears, but they bled through, crushing me from inside. I realized then that death might be my only way out. The thought came sudden but clear. If I died before they could take me fully, maybe they couldn't bind me. Maybe my soul wouldn't become another whisper in these walls. My knife felt heavy in my grip, blade dull but sharp enough to pierce skin. My hand shook violently as I raised it to my chest, but the figures reacted instantly. The voices cut into sharp screams, furious, desperate. The cabin shook violently, boards cracking, walls convulsing. They didn't want me dead. They wanted me alive, afraid, surrendering. The realization filled me with a strange, final strength. If they feared my death, then maybe that was victory. I pressed the blade against my chest, tears streaming down my face, whispering to myself, "You can't have me." The figures loomed closer, arms outstretched, whispers twisting into pleas now, begging me to stop. For the first time, they sounded afraid. With every ounce of will I had left, I drove the knife inward. Pain exploded, hot and sharp, flooding my chest. My legs buckled, the room spinning. The figures shrieked, their voices warping into a roar of rage and loss. The cabin convulsed violently, boards splintering, ceiling collapsing inward. I fell to the ground, warmth spreading beneath me, vision blurring. The last thing I saw was the cabin tearing apart from the inside, figures unraveling into smoke, words splitting into splinters, shadows screaming into the void. The last thing I heard was silence, and then, nothing. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying on the ground beside my truck. Morning sunlight warmed my skin. Birds called in the trees. The road stretched ahead, ordinary and calm. For a long time I lay there, gasping, clutching my chest. My shirt was torn, stained dark, but the wound was gone. No blood, no scar, only a dull ache where the knife had pierced. The truck started on the first turn of the key. I drove until I reached the nearest town, until I saw people again, until the noise of ordinary life wrapped around me like armor. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that part of me never left that cabin. At night, when I close my eyes, I hear whispers, not loud, not constant, just faint, curling at the edges of sleep. Sometimes they say my name. Sometimes they repeat that single word forever. And sometimes, when the house is still and the world outside is silent, I swear I smell mildew and smoke, and I feel the walls breathing. I don't tell these things to scare you. I tell them because they are true. If you ever find yourself stranded in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and someone tells you of an old cabin hidden deep in the woods, don't dismiss their warnings. Don't go looking for it, and if you stumble across it by accident, turn back. Walk through the night if you must, because if you step inside, it won't ever let you go. My name is Nathaniel Cross, and I am a trained forest ranger stationed in the state of Washington. For more than a decade, my profession has placed me in the deep wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, patrolling thousands of acres of forest, mountain ridges, river valleys, and stretches of ancient trees that tower higher than church steeples. I entered this career with a profound respect for the land, believing it to be both sanctuary and challenge, a place that demands humility but rewards patience and courage. Over the years, I have seen storms rip through valleys. I have battled wildfires that turned the skies orange for days. And I have walked miles of trails in pitch black night to locate lost hikers crying faintly in the distance. I thought myself hardened, tested, and prepared for anything the woods might hold. That belief would eventually betray me, because what I encountered in the deep woods of Washington will haunt my dreams for as long as I draw breath. It began during a season that should have been ordinary. Early autumn had settled over the Cascades, painting the slopes with gold and red, the rivers running brisk with recent rains. My assignment was simple, a multi-day patrol into an area rarely visited by tourists and seldom touched by human presence at all, a stretch of forest wedged between ridges that most hikers bypassed because there were easier routes to scenic lakes. My duty was to check trail conditions, monitor wildlife movements, and ensure that recent reports of illegal camps had no basis. The kind of trip where the solitude becomes your only company, where the silence of trees pressing close is broken only by the measured rhythm of your own boots and the occasional call of a raven. From the first day, I felt something unfamiliar humming beneath the usual calm. At first I dismissed it as the unease that sometimes accompanies a long journey alone. Even seasoned rangers experience that faint prickle of nerves when they realize how far they are from the nearest road, the nearest voice, the nearest cell phone signal. But this was not the ordinary awareness of isolation. This was different, a low thrum in my bones as though the forest itself recognized me, not as caretaker or guest, but as intruder. I pushed on, determined not to let imagination cloud judgment. My training had taught me that fear can grow like mold in silence, spreading until every creak of branch becomes threat, every shadow a predator. I walked beneath stands of Douglas, fir so vast their branches meshed into a canopy that shut out much of the afternoon sun. I crossed streams where salmon flashed in quicksilver arcs. I noted fresh tracks of elk and the claw marks of black bear scratched high on the trunks. All of it was normal, recorded dutifully in my logbook. Yet every step seemed to echo louder than it should, and sometimes I found myself glancing behind, though I knew nothing followed. That night, I made camp on a small rise overlooking a narrow valley. The ground was damp from earlier rain, but I cleared a patch, set up my tent, and built a modest fire with dry wood scavenged under leaning logs. The flames gave comfort, pushing back the press of dark, and for a while I told myself the unease was fading. But as the night deepened, and the forest chorus shifted from daytime chatter to the nocturnal rhythm of insects and owls, the sensation returned with double force. It was not simply that I felt watched. It was that the watching felt deliberate, intelligent, as though unseen eyes measured not only my movements, but the fact of my being there at all. At some hour after midnight I woke abruptly, heart racing, though I had heard no sound. The fire had burned low, leaving only embers, and the moon shone faint through a veil of clouds. My tent walls stirred with a faint breeze, yet the air inside was stifling, heavy with the scent of earth. I lay still, listening, and then I caught at a sound that did not belong. Somewhere down the slope, far enough that it could have been mistaken for trick of distance, came a cry. Not the high call of coyote, not the haunting whistle of owl, not even the scream of mountain lion. This was longer, broken, almost human, but warped, as though dragged out of a throat not made for words. I rose, unzipped the tent slowly, and crouched at the edge of the clearing. The forest stood in motionless ranks, black columns against darker night. The sound came again, a drawn-out wail that shifted midway into a low gurgle, then cut off with suddenness that left silence ringing. My instinct screamed at me to remain where I was, to retreat into canvas and wait for dawn. Yet training demanded vigilance, demanded that I understand what I faced, for if it was an injured hiker, then hesitation could mean death. I armed myself with flashlight and radio, though I knew the signal would not reach the outside world, and stepped cautiously into the trees. Each footfall seemed to sink deeper into soil than it should, and the beam of my light felt feeble, swallowed by the endless thickets. I moved slowly, marking landmarks with trained eye so I could find my way back. The cry did not repeat. Instead, as I descended toward the valley floor, the forest seemed to lean closer, branches knitting overhead until even the pale moon vanished. My breathing sounded harsh in my ears. I called out once, using my ranger's voice, clear and commanding. "This is Ranger Cross. If anyone needs assistance, call out." The only reply was the creak of wood. When I reached the stream at the bottom of the slope, I crouched to examine the bank. Mud held impressions, but not of boots. Not even of hooves or paws that I recognized. They were elongated, splayed like hands with too many fingers, pressed deep as though the weight behind them was immense. Water trickled through several, blurring edges, but enough remained to twist my stomach into knots. I knelt there far longer than reason allowed, trying to force logic onto what my eyes told me. No bear left such marks. No elk, no human. I withdrew only when I realized the night had grown too silent. Not merely hushed, but strangled as though the very air recoiled. Insects ceased. No owl hooted. Even the stream's babble seemed muted, smothered by the thickness of dark. My chest tightened with realization that I was not alone on that bank. Without meaning to, I lifted the light upward, and in that instant the beam caught something between the trunks. Two eyes, set too far apart, reflecting pale gold. They did not blink. They did not waver. They regarded me with an unbroken stare that pierced like spear through fog. I froze, every instinct in war with every teaching. Confront, retreat, hold ground. My training told me that most predators break off when faced with confidence, but there was no confidence in me then. Only raw dread. The eyes shifted slightly, and though no other shape became clear, I felt sure the thing stood upright, taller than any man, yet too thin for its height. My hand tightened on the flashlight, but a part of me knew that if the beam revealed the whole of it, I might lose my nerve entirely. Then, just as sudden as they had appeared, the eyes vanished. No rustle, no crunch of departure, only absence, leaving me trembling by the water's edge. I stumbled back up the slope, half running, not caring about silence now. When I reached camp, I found the fire dead out, though I knew I had left embers alive. I sealed myself into the tent, clutching knife and light, and did not close my eyes until dawn bled gray through fabric. The morning should have offered relief, yet it brought only deeper unease. Around the perimeter of my camp, impressed into soil damp with dew, were marks identical to those at the stream, hand-like, too many digits, circling as though the thing had walked round and round while I huddled unaware inside thin nylon walls. I could have turned back then. Perhaps I should have, but pride and duty are shackles of their own, and I told myself daylight would reveal rational answers. I convinced myself that footprints can mislead, that fear magnifies shadows, and so, instead of retreating, I pressed deeper into the wild, toward the heart of forest, where even maps rendered little more than contour lines. What followed across the next days stripped away every certainty I had about the natural world. What I saw, what I heard, what I felt pressing against the fragile shell of human comprehension, those memories will haunt me forever. And this is only the beginning. I broke camp with deliberate hands and told myself the circle of prints was a trick of bad sleep and wet ground. Denial is a tool as useful as any knife, at least until it fails you. I cleaned the pot until it squeaked, folded the tent tight to keep my fingers busy, and set a bearing toward the interior valley, where the map showed a finger of land pinched by two ridgelines. The old survey notes called it Basin 3. No trail ran through it, just dotted lines for drainages. A few contour hooks like scratch marks, and the blank space that always looks calm on paper and never is in person. Fog hung low enough that it kept catching on my hat brim and sliding off in small beads. The air smelled of wet cedar, and that particular cold, green scent ferns give off when they've been steeped all night. I moved softly, not because I cared about spooking anything, but because the hush felt asked of me, the way a chapel asks you to lower your voice without ever posting a sign. Sword ferns brushed my thighs. Nurse logs big as canoes lay furred with moss, collapsing into the soil they had once stood above. Every so often a Pacific Wren stitched 3 bright notes through the understory, and I took those as permission to keep walking. When I stopped, water dripped from the canopy with a patient metronome. When I went on, branches tapped my shoulders like an usher, moving me toward a seat I hadn't chosen. I took comfort in small labors. I cleared a slim alder that had fallen across a game path, logged the GPS, snapped a photo for a maintenance request no one would ever see. I noted black bear scat, filled with red skins from the sallow berries, a paw print smudged by last night's rain. All of it could live inside the book of the world I knew. Then the stream forked and deepened, and the remains of an old bridge leaned out of the water. 2 cedar uprights black with age and soot. When I palmed one, pitch smeared my glove and flashed a smoke smell that made no sense if the charring came from some decades-old fire. The uprights didn't lean by gravity. Vines and twined fibers pulled them toward each other, high overhead, knotted into a crude rib cage. It looked like a lesson in anatomy taught by someone who had only ever seen bones through a fogged window. The prints reappeared on the gravel bar below the uprights. I squatted and placed my hand next to one, where a wide palm on a big man might be 9 inches. These were near 13, splayed in a way that put too many digits into the earth. The stride between impressions would have set a hip at the height of my chest. I stood up and let the stream soak my boots to numb my ankles, because adding one more straightforward discomfort was easier than inhaling the shape of the thing that had made those tracks. A mile on, the valley tightened and an old logging road ghosted the slope, flat shelf, alder crowding, coils of rusted cable half swallowed by humps of grass. I followed it because it gave a line to trace with my body, and men do better with thread in a labyrinth. The road ended at a landing, a scraped circle half reclaimed by saplings. In the center, someone had piled driftwood into a cone and lashed it with thin lengths of bark. Feathers, raven, jay, and something long and dun I could not place, hung from the lashings. If it was a ritual, it was built by hands that understood both patience and weather. If it was a joke, it had no punchline. My radio hissed. I unclipped it with an oversized relief and pressed the talk button. Static held on a high whine, and then I heard my name, but not in my voice. Cross, it said. The word repeated, same breath at the same place, like a cassette's warbling loop. Cross. Cross, cross. The display showed no receiving channel. I rolled the squelch back and forth. The hiss didn't change. I tapped the casing against my thigh, because sometimes irrational acts jolt irrational problems. The radio went quiet as a stone in a pocket. Cloud lowered until the ridges were erased and drizzle set in. The kind that never splashes but soaks everything by steady argument. After an hour, my jacket gave up. Cold threaded my sleeves and rib cage, and I welcomed it the way you welcome a stern supervisor. Blunt rule, clear consequences. Then the woods shifted from the familiar to that wrong, kind of curious. Cedar grew at angles that made sense only if a storm had ripped root balls out and flung trunks back. But there were no pits where the roots should have torn free. Hemlock and cedar braided into one another. not grafted by chance but fused in clean pale seams like healed bone. I ducked under an arch 2 trunks had grown to form and felt, with the sudden conviction I reserved for the obvious and the dangerous, that I had walked through a door someone had meant me to find much later than I did. I stopped early, not because I was tired, but because I wanted fire and fabric between me and the dark, however illusory their safety. I set the tent on a knoll of cedar duff and ringed a small flame with stones slick, as if they'd lived in streams. Jerky and a handful of nuts made a dinner more functional than pleasant. I left the radio off. The quiet tucked itself around me like a weighted blanket that could smother as easily as comfort. Sleep came and went in pockets. I dreamed the bridge's rib cage flexed and let a river run between its bones. I woke to drizzle at least 3 times. The 4th time I woke not to sound but to color, a thin green that seeped through the tent walls as if the fabric had been dipped in seawater. Dawn in these woods is gray or salmon pink. This was neither. Outside, the trees were lit from within, not full on lanterns. Thin channels ran up the bark, glowing like sap that had learned to keep moonlight. Where 2 trunks leaned into each other, filaments arsed between them, fine as spider silk and humming just at the edge of hearing. Bioluminescent organisms don't surprise a ranger. Ghost fungus glows on logs in Australia. Some algae make shorelines shimmer, but these were Douglas, fir and cedar, and the light lived in them, not on them. When I tilted my head, the canopy flexed in a slow rhythm, tips lifting and settling, as if the crowns had taken a breath together. The sound it made, if sound is the word, was the memory of wind rather than wind itself. The green thinned and drained away like dye rinsed from cloth. Dark came back honest and heavy. I packed with numb hands and left without breakfast. For an hour I walked hard, only to circle into the same small meadow ringed with oxalis. I knew it by the alder with a lightning scar shaped like a human rib. I took out my compass, set a bearing in the opposite direction, and marched with the urgent stupidity that breeds mistakes. The meadow returned. The 3rd time my throat brought up a curse so loud, it sounded like another person was standing beside me. I put the compass back and knelt to look at the meadow floor, as if it could tell me how it lied. A sliver of obsidian turned up between my fingers from the duff. Too shiny, too sharp, not from here. I dropped it. The hair along my forearms rose as if the meadow had exhaled on me. Near midday, the trees drew back and the ground unrolled into a long bench of bare stone slicked with lichen. Water braided into silver threads across it. Tracks cut the wet lichen in lines too clean to be chance. Against whatever wisdom I had left, I followed them. The lines led to a seam where the stone split in a strip just wide enough to admit a body turned sideways. I squeezed through into a space that could be called a chamber if you were generous and had little else to call it. The ceiling arched like the inside of a rib cage again, and in the floor someone had laid a perfect circle of fist-sized stones. They were warm, not the warmth of sun, stored heat, which is diffuse and generous, but coin heat small, precise, as if each stone remembered a hand. In the middle of the ring, the floor went dark and pitted like old bone. I stood there too long, distracted by geometry and the pity you feel for a human effort left to the damp. Pressure built in my face, behind my eyes and along my sinus ridge, the way the air changes before a storm. When I turned back to the seam, stone had slid into it with the noiseless certainty of a lid finding a box. I put both palms on it and felt the give of muscle rather than rock, a resistance that pushed back without moving. I wanted to keep the circle whole out of courtesy for someone else's work, but survival outranks manners. I stepped over the ring and felt the air lift, not breeze, not draft, but a letting go, like heavy doors separating inches. When I tried the seam again, The stone yielded and light in a thin bar swung across the floor. I left by it with the absurd urge to apologize. Past that, I stopped pretending this patrol was normal. I moved fast, and the forest moved out of my way with that unnerving cooperation the wild sometimes gives when it wants you anywhere but where you were. Late light filtered, and with it the sound of a river not babbling, but talking in a steady, low sentence. The slope turned to clay, and let me slide to the bank on both heels. The water ran hawk, feather gray and strong enough to wrinkle distance. Directly across, the opposite bank rose not as soil, but as a wall, uprights driven side by side for 30 yards, braced with a lattice of crosspieces, gaps set small enough to slow anything with legs. Where the wall faced upstream, it narrowed into a V like a ship's prow, and back of that, the lattice opened into a throat, leading to a pool so dark I could not see bottom. I have seen beaver feats that look like engineering projects, and men build foolish structures in places nothing should be built. This was neither. This was a trap with a mouth big enough to drink a tree. The mud below me wore the hand prints again, a palimpsest overlaying overlay, until the clay looked calmed by a giant. I placed my own palm inside one and felt, in that useless place in the chest that can go tight and hot all at once, how small I was. My radio turned itself on inside my pack. The volume wheel rasped along the canvas pocket and rolled, white noise unspooled, and then settled into a voice I knew too well. It was me 2 years ago, during a search for a boy who had been found only as a first name on a poster and a pair of shoes in a culvert. The recording dispatch kept for debriefings now bled into this present, thin with compression and threadbare from being played too often. We found tracks heading toward the creek. He's not alone. Silence followed, same length, same weight, like the past had exhaled into the mouth of my current day. I switched bands until numbers on the display were nonsense to the region. The voice kept speaking the exact same 3 sentences and kept not helping. I left the wall because I did not want to learn what it ate, and because once you understand a thing's food, you have to measure yourself against it. The timber away from the river offered thorns and devil's club, and the clean honesty of physical pain. By last light the fog came down again, and rain came with it. So I nested a small fire in a cradle of limbs on the lee side of a blown snag and worked it along with patience. Heat found me in pieces. I boiled water and salted it like a man seasoning himself back together. Then the world went quiet. Not the common hush of snow or the pause between gusts. This was a switch thrown. The rain still fell but made no sound on nylon. The fire curled bright but did not crackle. When I touched the pot, it sang at my finger, thin and pure. The silence was not absence. It was pressure. Something was pacing the edge of light. The steps came without rhythm, as if the walker hadn't learned cadence. A scrape and a long pause. Another scrape that ended in a wet drag my teeth could feel. I stood with the knife, because a blade doesn't make you safe, it makes you pay attention. I lifted the flashlight and stepped beyond the fire. The beam took a breath and then found a plane to hold. A face looked back, if face is the right word for a mask put together by a mind that had read about faces, but never seen one close. 2 eyes sat too far apart under plates like old antler polished by river. A split where a nose would be showed cords behind it that pulled open and shut with each breath. A line of wet along the edge of the plates turned to a spill of droplets when it moved, and the droplets hung like beads for a half second before falling. It braced one hand on a tree. The hand's heel fit the trunk like the tree had been grown for it, fingers fanning to 8 with a small 9th, nested near the wrist like a dew claw. At the end of each, a flattened pad darker than the rest pressed. The bark beneath had taken a polish. I understood without wanting to that this was not its first study of firelight. We regarded each other, my mind, sliding away from the hole, caught on strange details. A scar on the left plate, a thin white rope of tissue that disappeared under the edge near the eye. On the right plate, grooves cut in clean parallel. Not weathering, not accident. Deliberate marks made by something with a fine edge. Notches, counting. It stepped back and the pads peeled off the bark with a sound like gum lifting from a tabletop. It left the circle of light and sound returned all at once. Rain ticking, fire talking. Some barred owl far off asking who cooks for you. And I loved that bird for sounding ordinary. I did not sleep until Grade pried the black open. I made coffee hard enough to make my eyes water and drank it like an apology to my nerves. With the map spread on my knee, I drew a line that no committee would approve and no supervisor would praise straight for the ridge by the shortest path. In storms and terror both, elevation is a form of honesty. The climb burned calves and rinsed my chest with cold air that felt like medicine. Halfway up, fog thinned into strands and slid back into the basin like a herd of gray animals. I came to a shoulder and crossed a stand of silver snags where lightning had cleaned the bark away and left trunks like spears. At the far side, a post stood hammered into soil so hard I had to lean full weight to shift it. Someone had cut it square at the top and carved a single deep notch, clean, edged, recent. 20 feet away another post, 2 notches, a third, 4 notches. I walked the perimeter of a rough circle the size of a small house and counted posts and marks. 1 through 14 on one side, then 13 on the other. 27 in all. I knew that number. I had carried it the way you carry grit in a boot, and pretend you don't. Plenty of rationalities to excuse it, and none that remove it. 27 missing persons across the cluster of counties around these woods in the last decade, found as names on flyers, as weather, soft photographs taped to gas station doors, as prayers said into microphones in gymnasiums, but not found as bodies. People do foolish things in wild places. People vanish in mountains with no help from nightmares. And still the Tali lived here where lightning had once walked, carved into wood that would outlast a dozen storms. I said no, out loud, to the snags and the fog, and the thing that leaned on trunks to watch me. The trees gave me nothing back, and I didn't deserve anything anyway. Speaking the decision out loud rewired me enough to move. I took photographs. I recorded a note in my field log with time and coordinates. Then I pushed for the spine of the ridge until I could sit it like a saddle and see the basin fall away in hemlock shag on one side, and on the other, a valley I knew by its river's bright elbow and a pale strip of sedge meadow. Civilization lay in that direction. I followed the narrow back north to a rock knob bare enough to offer clean sky for a radio try. The first 5 calls fell into static, small teeth chewing. The 6th carried far enough to catch. 7, Bravo Cross, this is dispatch, do you copy? The voice threaded the wind like a line thrown with perfect aim. My throat closed and opened, and I put the calm back on my voice the way you press a bandage over a wound. Dispatch Cross, I copy. On a ridge above Basin 3, bearing north-northeast to Meadow Fork. I meant to say a helicopter, a line of rangers, a flood of protocol. What I said was, I need you to record the next part exactly. I meant to tell them about the wall in the river, and the ring of stones, and a hand with 9 digits and marks on its face. I meant to say 27 into a system that would have to write it down. The radio filled with the thin keen of a child, and then it snapped to silence so hard my ears rang. I called again. The frequency stayed empty. Below me, the basin moved, not branches swaying, a pattern that repeated, then repeated, like a drummer who knew only 2 measures and was determined to pound them until the forest rewrote the song around it. The feeling along my spine was not fear now. It was the cold point of attention sharpened to a needle. I turned north and moved, not because I thought I could outrun anything, but because the line between witness and hunted had thinned to a thread, and distance is one of the few tools that keeps threads from snapping. The ridge swayed under my boots as if the mountain breathed, and, for a blinking second, I felt something larger than the weather turn its face toward me. The world, old and patient, seemed to say without a voice, "We are not finished with you yet." I pressed on along the ridge with the steady rhythm of a man who knows that if he falters, the whole of his will might collapse. Rocks shifted under my boots, sometimes breaking loose and tumbling into the valley below with hollow clatters that seemed too loud in the quiet. Every sound echoed longer than it should, as though the stone itself were reluctant to release it. The fog thinned in patches, but never enough to give me more than a glimpse at what lay beyond. Slopes dropping into endless tree crowns, ravines carved by unseen rivers, and a sweep of wilderness so vast it felt like I was trespassing on a world untouched by human claim. The feeling that I had crossed some boundary into a domain not meant for men would not leave me, no matter how tightly I clung to training or reason. By midday the sun broke through for a brief, brittle span. I used it to recalibrate my bearings, taking out map and compass with trembling hands. The forest below the ridge seemed to ripple, waves moving across it without wind. I told myself it was the trick of light playing on layers of foliage, but I could not look too long without my chest tightening as though my body feared recognition of something my mind refused to name. My goal was clear: reach the Meadow Fork Valley, push through to the ranger outpost a dozen miles north. I had made that distance before in worse weather, but this time the miles seemed to stretch, doubling behind me, so that when I looked back, the ground appeared longer than I had walked. It was as if the landscape itself resented my progress and sought to erase it. When I descended into the tree line again, the air shifted. Warmer, thicker, damp with a musk that clung to my nostrils. The scent was not rot nor fresh growth, but something between, like the breath of composting leaves mixed with iron. My ears picked up faint clicking sounds, irregular at first, then in pairs, then in rapid bursts like teeth chattering. The noise traveled ahead and behind, a chorus that moved as I moved. Once a twig snapped distinctly to my right, and when I swung the beam of my flashlight that way, it caught only trunks pressed close. But the trunks bore marks, fresh gashes cut into bark in long vertical streaks, as if something had dragged hand, like digits down their length in passing. Sap blood pale from them, still wet enough to glisten. The streaks were at the height of my chest, then higher, until some rose beyond reach of even the tallest man. That night I made camp reluctantly in a shallow clearing, where the undergrowth gave way to bare earth. My body demanded rest, but every part of me balked at the thought of sleeping exposed. I built no fire, fearing the light would draw more of those watching eyes. I ate dry rations in silence, chewing until the crumbs formed a paste I swallowed with difficulty. I forced myself to write in my log, though my words grew jagged and terse. Day 3, I recorded. Unexplained prints, structures, noises, possible ritual sites. Feeling of pursuit intensifying. My handwriting shook so much I could hardly recognize it as mine. I set the log aside and lay flat with my knife near my hand, eyes open to the canopy. At some hour between midnight and dawn, when the body craves most to collapse, I heard footsteps. They circled slowly around the clearing, dragging now and then as though something long brushed against the ground. I held my breath until my chest burned. The steps passed, faded, and then began again on the opposite side, as if mocking the thin courage I had left. Dawn found me gray and hollow. The circle of ground around my camp bore new marks, impressions in the soil, shaped like palms splayed wide. Too many fingers. Some prints overlapped my own boot tracks, almost as though deliberately placed there. I left the clearing in haste, half running at times, though every ranger instinct shouted that running wastes strength. The forest grew denser, branches clawing at my jacket, moss muffling each footfall. Hours passed in a haze of exertion until I broke out onto a dry wash strewn with granite boulders. Here, finally, the sun fell clean, lighting every surface. Relief surged through me, absurd in its strength. I drank deeply from my canteen, splashed water across my face, and for a fleeting instant believed I had left the worst behind. That illusion broke when I saw movement atop one of the boulders. A figure crouched there, long-limbed, its outline fractured by shadow. At first glance it looked like a man, hunched with arms braced against knees. But the arms were too long, reaching nearly to the stone itself, and the head turned farther than a human's neck allows, following me with that same gold, flecked stare I had seen by the stream. My hand went to the flashlight, though daylight rendered it useless. The figure rose in a fluid, deliberate motion, standing taller than any man I'd known, and its outline shimmered faintly as though the air itself tried to conceal it. Then, in a blink, it was gone, leaving only the empty stone and my ragged breathing. I crossed the wash in a stumbling hurry, refusing to look back. The valley narrowed again into trees, and with it returned the silence, the stifling, strangled kind that swallowed even the sound of my own steps. I tested it once, clapping my hands. The echo did not return. The sound vanished at the edge of my palms as though the air consumed it. Panic welled sharp in my gut. I began speaking aloud, anything to anchor myself, my name, my ranger ID. The date, the description of the terrain. The words cut short, thin and brittle, as if spoken underwater. I thought of radios of dispatch, of voices repeating names on lost person bulletins. The thought tightened my throat until I nearly wept. By afternoon, I reached the edge of Meadow Fork. The valley spread below, meadows stretching pale green under a lid of mist. For the first time in days, I saw a structure, the outpost cabin, a small rectangle of roofline where timber gave way to grass. Relief flooded me so fast it nearly dropped me to my knees. I hurried down the slope, boots sliding on loose soil, stumbling more than walking. The cabin door stood ajar, swaying faintly on its hinges. I called out before entering. Ranger Cross, reporting. Anyone here? My voice sounded feeble in the empty space. Inside, the cabin smelled of mildew and dessous. Dust filmed the table, and the radio equipment on the shelf was dead, its power light unlit. A bedroll lay unrolled in the corner, damp and mold-stained as though no one had touched it for years. But the logbook on the table was recent. Its last entry bore yesterday's date, written in a hand too similar to my own, arrived. Circled again last night. Cannot leave. I recoiled as though burned. The words blurred before my eyes, but I knew every stroke of the pen belonged to me. My heart battered my ribs in terror. I slammed the logbook shut and staggered outside, gasping air thick as syrup. The meadow around the cabin lay hushed, grass unmoving despite the faint breeze that touched my face. The stillness pressed until I could not tell if the world beyond the meadow still existed. I wanted desperately to flee, yet every direction looked the same, as though the meadow stretched endless no matter where I turned. As night approached, the grass began to move, not with wind, but with rhythm. Blades bent in patterns, swaying side to side as though trodden by invisible feet. Circles formed, then broke, then formed again, weaving wider each time. My body refused to obey the command to run. I stood rooted, watching as the circles closed toward the cabin like ripples spreading inward. Within the grass, I glimpsed shapes rising. Thin, tall, jointed wrong. Eyes gleaming gold. They walked without sound, without weight, yet their presence pressed against me harder than stone. I stumbled backward into the cabin and barred the door, though I knew wood meant nothing. Through the cracks I saw them gather, dozens perhaps, circling, swaying with the grass. One drew closer, placing a palm against the wall. Fingers spread across half the planks, nails digging faint furrows into the wood. The cabin shuddered as though the touch itself carried weight beyond its form. The night lasted an eternity. The beings circled without pause, their eyes shining in and out of cracks. Sometimes I heard my own name spoken in my voice, sometimes in others, sometimes in dozens at once, all whispering, "Cross," until the word lost meaning. At some hour I blacked out, not from sleep but from sheer collapse of mind. When dawn came, pale and merciful, the meadow stood empty again. Grass bent flat in rings testified to their presence, spirals pressed into earth that no wind could have shaped. I left the cabin without looking back. The logbook remained inside, its words mocking me, and I refused to touch it again. My only thought was to escape, to find a road, a trail, any sign of human presence. I stumbled through the meadow into forest, branches whipping my face, thorns clawing my arms. I ran until my lungs burned, until the forest blurred into a smear of green and black. When at last I collapsed to my knees, gasping, I looked up to find myself standing before the same stream I had crossed days before, the same rib, cage uprights looming above. The circle had closed. I was back where I had begun. The uprights loomed before me as if they had been waiting, black ribs knotted overhead into that crude cage. I dropped to the stream bank, pressing my palms into the mud, because part of me still clung to the hope that the world had not bent, that I had only misjudged direction, doubled back by mistake. My compass needle spun in lazy circles, pointing nowhere. The stream itself seemed to curl around my boots and then retreat, as if water could think, as if it recognized me and chose to refuse me passage. I rose shaking, rage trying to burn through fear. I shouted into the canopy, words torn from my throat. "Nuff. I know this forest! You don't own it!" My voice sounded small, strangled. The woods swallowed it whole without echo, and the silence that followed pressed heavier than my outburst. I pushed upriver along the bank, moving fast, mud splashing up my legs. The smell of iron thickened. The prints returned, deep in the silt, hand-shaped and endless. Some faced forward, some sideways, some backward, as though whatever left them did not care which way its body turned. A madness rose in me, a frantic urge to obliterate the marks. I stamped one under my boot, grinding until the shape blurred. When I lifted my foot, the print was still there, clear as before, as if the ground itself refused to be altered. Night fell with a swiftness that made no sense for the season. One moment dusk, the next a crushing blackness. I lit my headlamp though the battery was failing. The beam struck trees that leaned toward me, branches knotted like arms reaching. I heard the clicks again, louder now, answering each other from both sides of the river. The pace grew faster, building into a clattering rhythm like bone castanets. I gripped my knife until my knuckles screamed. Then came the voices. My own, first, repeating fragments from old patrol logs. Then others' names I had read on missing person flyers, whispered as though the forest had stored them. Ali, Samantha, Cole. The voices circled, never overlapping, each distinct, each too close. I stumbled into a clearing where firelight flickered without source. The flame hovered in midair, a spiral that wound higher with each heartbeat until it towered above me. In its glow, I saw shapes around the edges of the clearing. Dozens, maybe more. Thin and too tall, with faces that flickered in and out of coherence, never steady. Some wore plates of bone across their features. Some had hollows where eyes should be. One bent low, head cocked, and I recognized the scar etched into its left plate. The same one I had seen watching me from the tree line. It had been following all along, marking me. Waiting. The fire spiral bent toward me, heatless but suffocating. Whispers rose from it, A chorus of all the names at once, growing until the sound pressed into my skull like hands shoving. I dropped to my knees, palms clamped over my ears, but the voices lived inside bone. They told me to stay. They told me I had been counted. They told me 27 was not the end. I screamed back, though the words dissolved, my throat tearing raw. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was gone. I was back at the cabin. Its door gaped wide, logbook still on the table. My own handwriting filled every page now, not just one entry. Lines upon lines, paragraphs sprawling, all written in my hand but none remembered. Some described trails I had never walked, rivers I had never seen. Others listed names I knew only as missing, with details no search reports had ever uncovered. Each name ended the same way, circled. My stomach lurched. I staggered outside, bile rising. The meadow was no meadow now, but a vast hollow, grass laid flat into concentric rings, spiraling inward toward a pit I swore had not been there before. From its center rose a breath, hot and moist, like the exhale of something too large to see all at once. I backed away, my boots catching in bent grass. Around the rim of the hollow stood the figures, tall and still. They did not move. They did not need to. The rings themselves shifted, bending under invisible weight, tightening. I ran, though the circles seemed endless, meadow folding into itself with each stride. My lungs seared, my legs numbed. When I tripped and fell, the grass beneath me was damp with something thick. My hands came away streaked red. Blood, pooled in the grooves of the spirals, trickled toward the pit. I crawled until I found forest again. Trunks closed around me, roots rising like bars, canopy blotting even starlight. My headlamp failed then, bulb popping with a soft hiss. Darkness swallowed me whole. I pressed forward blind, feeling bark scrape my arms. I don't know how long I walked like that, bruised and stumbling, guided only by a pull I could not name. At last a faint glow appeared ahead, green, like before, bleeding through the trees. I reached it and found another circle of stonehole, larger than the first, each rock slick with something that pulsed faintly beneath the surface. In the center lay an object, my radio. I picked it up with shaking hands. The power light blinked, though the battery had long since died. Static hissed, then broke into a child's voice, thin and trembling. "Help me." The words looped, rising in pitch until they no longer resembled speech. I hurled the radio into the dark. It landed with a sound not of plastic on soil, but of flesh slapping wet ground. A moment later, something out there repeated the sound perfectly, mocking. Then came a long silence. I could feel them gathered, just beyond reach, waiting for me to take the next step. I turned in circles, desperate, and found myself facing the posts I had seen before on the ridge. The carved tally of 27. But now new notches had been added. I counted them by touch, fingers tracing raw grooves. 28, 29, 30. My knees buckled. I pressed my forehead to the post, wood damp against skin, and whispered to myself that I would not be the next mark. I would not. The forest disagreed. From the dark came the click of digits on bark. Hundreds of them, joined in rhythm until the night became a drum beat. It pressed against my chest, matched my heart, threatened to stop it altogether. I ran again. No sense of direction, only away. Trees thrashed past. My body tore on branches, blood-slicking sleeves. The drumbeat followed, faster, louder, closer, until I thought the very air would shatter. Then, sudden as a trap springing, the ground fell away. I plunged down a slope, tumbling through brush, crashing into rocks until I landed hard in shallow water. Pain flared bright, but above it came another realization: the river here was different. It ran true, loud, unbroken, not muffled by the silence that had followed me for days. Its current surged clean, tugging at me with force that felt real, honest. I staggered to my feet, letting the water pull at my legs. The drumbeat faltered on the far bank, the clicks retreating. Whatever haunted the forest hesitated here. I waded deeper, chest heaving. For the first time since this began, hope sparked in me. That perhaps the river marked a boundary, that perhaps I could escape if I followed it. But the river had other plans. As I moved with it, the current thickened, slowing until it felt less like water and more like syrup. My legs dragged. I looked down and saw hands, those same two, many fingers, pressing from beneath the surface, clutching at my boots, my calves, dragging me deeper. The current was not current at all, but a living thing. I fought, thrashing, clawing for the far bank. My knife tore at water that was not water. I screamed until my throat shredded. Somehow I broke free, hauling myself onto the stones. I collapsed there, body shaking, lungs racked with sobs. When I raised my head, dawn bled across the treetops. The drumbeat had vanished. The silence, at least for that moment, had lifted. Birds called. A jay screeched. Normal sounds, sweet as salvation. I staggered upright, swearing I would follow the river wherever it led, swearing I would not look back again. And yet when I turned, my eyes betrayed me. Across the water, lined on the far bank, stood the figures. Dozens of them, motionless, their eyes gold in the dawn. And behind them, towering above the tree line, something vast stirred. A shape too immense to comprehend. Ribs arching like mountains, head hidden in cloud. My knees weakened. The truth cut through me sharp as the cold air. This forest was not simply haunted. It was alive, and it had noticed me. I followed the river because it was the first thing in days that behaved like itself. Even when it thickened into that syrup, grabbed and tried to keep me. Even when hands pressed up from its skin, like things waking out of a dream, the water still moved downhill and made sense of gravity. And that was a gospel I could walk beside. I kept my boots on the stones, just above the lick of current, and matched my breath to its rush. Across the far bank they stood in their tidy line, close enough that I could see dew beating on the plates of their faces, far enough that the river's chatter drowned the clicks they made to speak to one another. When I tripped and went to a knee, they tilted in unison, as if a single attention had shifted angles. I stopped looking at them, because watching was an invitation to panic, and panic in the backcountry writes obituaries. The ridge to my left rose from the river like the flank of some enormous sleeping thing, its crown in fog. Every 100 yards or so the bank cut back, and I had to step into the water to get around a boulder or breach, and each time my legs remembered the drag and tried to sepal, I talked to my body in the same tone I used for skittish hikers in the field. Not calm. Calm is a fiction you invent for other people. But steady, practical. Left foot. Ref foot. Look 3 steps ahead. Stay low under the willow. Where the bank crumbles, angle toward the alder roots and use them like a ladder. When the voices came thin from the trees on the far side, Eli, Samantha, Cole, and the long list past that, I named features in response: undercut bank, old flood line, last year's debris. It did not make the voices stop. It made me real to myself. Near mid-morning the river bent around a shoulder of stone, and the world opened. A side valley shouldered into the main course here, and down that feeder a white seam stitched its way. Falls, not high, but busy and complicated. Water stepping itself down in shelves and lips. The spray lifted moss smell into the air, with a sweetness so clean it rang like metal. I dropped to a squat, and let my hands hang between my knees, and listened to that sound until the tremble in my legs flattened out. Across from me, above a flat tongue of black rock, stood a structure I first mistook for blown timber, until the lines resolved. Uprights again, but these carved square, interlaced with crosspieces tongue, and grooved tight as joinery in an old church, braced against the current with a stubbornness bordering on character. The opening formed a V pointing upstream, and either side of that V was netting. No, not netting, not fiber. the sinewed stuff of tendons, pale and tough, lashed into a mesh so fine it made the river look slow behind it. I smelled iron, and my mouth tasted like a penny. I did not need to be a genius to understand what the throat and the mesh made together. Fish ladders started somewhere in men's minds as this same idea. The difference was scale and hunger. Inside the throat lay a pool so dark it returned no shine, and I had the childish impulse to toss a stone in to prove a bottom existed, and the adult recognition that proof was not the point. Along the crosspieces hung things that had been in the world longer than a season. A rusted bear bell and a child's sneaker laced to itself. A ranger's shoulder patch with the edges chewed into a fringe. A photograph slipped into a crack and held there, by nothing but will. A boy of 8 or 9 with the kind of haircut parents give before school pictures, his hand raised at the moment of the shutter, like he had just discovered, or had just been told to show, that he had 5 fingers. I stood too long in a place where standing was a decision. The line of them on the far bank began to break into 5s and 3s, each group angling along the edge to keep pace with me as I cut downstream. Where the river narrowed to a chute, I saw a log jam make a rough bridge, and I knew from training that crossing the kind of log jam a river has made for itself will teach you humility, and crossing it because you're being watched will teach you a different thing entirely. Still, the choice of turn back or go across is one men have made since caves were the only roofs. I tapped the log with my boot, waited for the smallest rock to drop and the smallest piece of bark to lift, and started low, hands on slick wood, mind on the creek bed below, so I'd stop thinking about faces. Halfway, one of them stepped onto the near end of the jam. It did not test the wood like I had. It placed its hand, 8 fingers and the little dew nub near the wrist, flat on the great trunk and pressed, and the entire jam answered with a creak that lived up my forearms and into the hinge of my jaw. It glanced at me sideways, the way an elk will when it wants you to know it's thinking of charging, but not whether it's convinced. I took one hand off the log to fumble at my chest pocket. The flare was a stub, cylinder scuffed, cap bent out of round. Rangers carry them out of proportion to how often we need them. Light and noise can be the difference between story and eulogy. Don't, I said, to the flare, to the thing, to whatever watched us both through the skin of the world. The cap came free. The striker rasped and nothing caught. The second rasp gave me a spark the size of a flea. The third found a stubborn vein and bled a ragged, stubborn light. The white core spat and then established, hard and clean. I held it out the way I had been taught, angled down and away, because a flare is a liar about gentleness. The thing absorbed the light without blinking, and in the sick flare glare, I saw the notches carved across the right plate of its face were more numerous than I had thought, each groove cut with a care that told me it had learned edges the way men learn alphabets. It moved back, not in fear but precision. The way you step off a hot slate, you know, will still be hot tomorrow. Behind it, some of the others pulled away from the bank's lip, and one leaned long enough into the light that I finally saw the plates were not plates at all, but layers, something like bone grown over something like cartilage grown like thick leaves. The flare ate itself in a fast white breath. When it guttered, the dark drank our little geometry and handed me back nothing. I shoved the dead stick in the river and crossed the rest of the jam with my chest pressed to wet bark and a refusal to look up. On the far bank, the path away from the water grew obvious if not merciful. The slope lifted in a version of a trail deer, pick through sword fern, bear push through salmonberry. Men pretend they are making choices, not just taking advantage of what the mountain allows. Climbing stole breath but gave distance, and distance turned the clicks back into suggestion. I kept the river's voice to my left and angled toward the fall line, where the trees began to thin. Open-grown Douglas, fir white in their crowns, and give light back to the ground, and I made for that promise like a thirsty man makes for a shaded porch. Another 50 yards, and the green under my feet changed from wet to gray, and then crunchy as glass. I put a hand out and found bark that came off in sheets, and a branch that ringed at the slightest touch. I had walked into a burned scar, old enough that snag tops were blunted and the grass between black trunks had rooted, young enough that the memory of fire still lived in the soil in a way the nose recognizes as certainty. Relief took me sideways. Fire is terrible, but it is honest, and a ridge that has burned is a ridge that offers a line of sight. I could see the sky fully for the first time in too many days. I could see a power corridor cut in the near distance, not live. The poles long since down, but still straight where straightness had been laid across contour. I could see a cluster of posts someone had sunk along the ridge, and I knew them before I put my hands on them. The counts. The number I had turned into a pocket stone, turning it over until it had gone smooth 27. They had grown in my absence. 30 posts, then 31, the notches so fresh under my fingertips the edges were almost tacky. The 32nd stood newly set, wobble in the earth, not yet packed hard. "No notch! Not me!" I said. And again, because saying a thing twice makes the mouth believe, and once you can make your own mouth believe, you have a start. Not me. Wind came. Nothing like a storm. Just a moving mass of air that turned the burned snags into a choir of hollow reeds. Between notes I heard the small talk under the wind, different from the clicks, more like the way ravens gossip, something like amusement, something like deliberation. My radio, inert so long I had quit insulting it with hope, woke in my pack and spoke with dispatch's voice. The relief that surged up made me stupid. I let it have me, and I had the talk button pressed before any part of me could object. "Dispatch, 7, Bravo Cross," I said. "Ridge above Meadow Fork burn. Possible cut to old line. Request." The sound that cut me off wasn't the child's voice this time. It was my own, giving a location nowhere near here. A road name out of a completely different district. Then another voice, my captain's, calm and clipped, the way she could be when things were sliding sideways. "Cross, stay put. Helicopter 5 minutes out." Then the sound of rotors, perfect to a degree that made me flinch. No chop changes with terrain, no thrum stutter, nothing to tell the ear there was mass being hauled through air. I let the button go. The chopper noise passed overhead, precise, as if tracing a circle cut into the sky itself, and then moved off to my right and did not fade with distance so much as shut off like a light. "If you can imitate them," I said, not sure who I was talking to, "you can imitate us. That's not a win for you. It just means you moved closer to the wrong god." I didn't expect a reply, and I didn't get one. The posts waited with their one blank still offered. The burn ridge slid away north toward the corridor cut, and beyond that lay country like a man had drawn it. Section lines and spur roads, and that little half-mile stretch where someone had once planned a campground and then hadn't found the budget. I put my hand on each post as I passed, the way you touch a friend's arm who doesn't know how to accept help and doesn't want to be left alone, and counted backwards out loud like my grandfather had taught me when he wanted a scared boy to stop hyperventilating. 31, 30, 29. By 23 the wind shifted and brought me the smell of creosote, faint but there, the ghost of railroad ties. The corridor itself was grief and blessing. Where the poles had come down long ago, insulators glittered in grass, half-swallowed porcelain moons. Where brush had tried to take the cutback, someone, human, had walked it within the year and knocked it down with a blade. Human. The word made me dizzy, like I'd stood too fast. I wanted to shout in the direction of that effort and tell them they had done a kindness and I owed them a beer. Instead, I walked, because men who talk too much in the woods learn things the woods didn't mean to teach. The line led me to a road so rutted it would have broken an axle, but so unequivocally made that my body took it as permission to shake. I let myself sit in the gravel and cry the way a man will when tension has turned his bones into cables and someone has finally cut them. When the pressure eased, I got up, wiped my face, and started down. The sun found a hole in the thin cloud and put a square of light on the hillside ahead. On the near side of that light stood a figure in a ranger's jacket. For a second, relief carved me hollow. I raised my hand and called out my name in a "hey" that cracked like a teenager's. The figure raised a hand in return. It moved forward with the easy economy of someone who had spent most of their adult life walking uneven ground. And in that little movement I realized two things that slapped me sober. The jacket was mine. The notches across the right plate of the face had notched one more line since I had last counted them. I did not run at it. I did not stand and pretend not to be a man who could be cornered. I stepped off the road into the ditch and walked the ditch like it was its own road, the way animals do when they like to use the thing men built without being caught by the rules baked into it. The figure matched me stride for stride on the crown of the road, and when it came abreast it tipped its head, almost a courtesy, and laid its hand on one of the old poles stacked beside the cut. There were marks in the creosote where pads had polished it. When it leaned away, it left an impression as neat as a signature. I told it, because sometimes names are a tool, and sometimes they are a net. You're not getting me with mine. I won't wear my own jacket to my own funeral. I did not expect the words to be anything but a balm to my own fear. It made a sound I had not heard from them before, something small and high and cracked that I realized, 2 seconds later than I wanted to, was laughter. The ditch led to a culvert. On the far side the road bent into trees, and beyond those trees I could make out the wedge of the maintenance yard's roof, brown and shingled the way roofs are when a budget doesn't match a best practice. Trucks, fuel, a refrigerator where food sits without needing to be hung in a tree at night, a door that locks, and right there, absurd in its decency, a flag whipping itself around a short pole as the wind remembered how to gust. The only problem between me and those ordinary things was distance, and the thing that liked distance in the way cats like threshold lines. I crossed the culvert. Gravel pop. A jay shouted the kind of insult that jays get away with. On the far side I took the middle of the road. I don't know why. Maybe because I needed to stop acting like prey. Maybe because there is a kind of prayer you can only make when you give up on ritual and choose embarrassment. The figure kept its pace and then, without fanfare, let me pull ahead. When I glanced back, I couldn't help it. I saw that it had raised a hand, like a man shading his eyes to look up slope, and the others along the timber edge had done the same. They weren't watching me anymore. Their faces had tipped to the ridge behind the yard. A sound reached me, the unmistakable laboring cough of an engine that hasn't been warmed in a week. I laughed, which tasted like blood because somewhere along the way I had bitten the inside of my cheek to ribbons. The chain link gate stood shut. The padlock wore rust like a scab. I put both hands on the mesh and shook until it sang. Movement inside a figure in a hooded sweatshirt, then the hood pushed back and a human face. Human not because it matched mine, but because it didn't. Pimples tracked one cheek, eyebrows wild, mouth set in a line that said he'd been told this is your job and wasn't convinced. He came to the gate and stopped with a professionalism that made me want to hug him. "You okay, man?" he asked. My voice took a moment to find its shape. When it did, it was smaller than I had imagined, but serviceable. Ranger Cross, I said. I need a phone and a vehicle. And for you to keep your eyes down if you hear your name. He blinked. Kate, he said, doubt in the vowels. He lifted the chain, wrestled the lock. And I had the sudden terror that the old iron would hold just to prove it could. It gave, grudgingly. He swung the gate. I stepped through and did not turn to check the tree line. He swung it shut at once the way a man will if someone has taught him that the first thing you do when a dog comes in at night is get the door between you and the dark. Phone's in the office, he said. Truck'll take a jump, but I can. Hey, you're bleeding. I'll get to it, I said. And he put his hands up in that innocent surrender that says, okay. I asked the thing I feel required to ask for the sake of decency, and now I will move on. In the office, the fluorescent tube buzzed like a fly. The clock on the wall was 5 minutes behind my watch, which felt like an insult given the elasticity time had offered me lately. But it was such a human kind of insult I could have kissed the clock. I picked up the phone and the tone that came was a real tone, live and bored. I dialed dispatch. I gave my name and the yard's designation and spoke the words the world expects of a ranger. Need medical, I said. No major bleeding. No fractures I can find. Just, I couldn't say haunted, and not because it sounded childish. I couldn't say haunted because it was too small. Just situational exposure. Extended duration. Potential PTSD, dispatch said. And the relief that voice kept ordinary buttered the space behind my ribs so well I could breathe deeper than I had since the first night. Units en route. Hold there. You are not to return to field without command authorization. Copy, I said. She started to ask the next question and stopped midway through the first word. A silence that was not static but surprise. Ranger Cross, she said, voice climbing a step. I have you already logged on Channel 5. You're on a ridge near Basin 3. You just requested we record your statement exactly. I didn't, I said, and then, before she could frame that into a protocol note, I did. But I didn't now. I did then. This is now. A beat. Then, cool, we'll keep both. I hung up because the landline started speaking back to me in my own voice. And I did not need to add that to the list of things to give me dreams. The kid with the hood was outside with cables clamped to a truck that had seen better administrations. He looked up when I stepped into air and gave me the once. Over a young man gives an older one when he wants to know how much he has to carry. You gonna sit? He said. Not a question. I'm gonna sit, I agreed. The seat stunk of dust and spilled coffee. It was the most beautiful smell in the world. He turned the key. The truck coughed and then decided to trust us. He drove the half-mile to the blacktop like a man taking a cake out of a house full of cats. At the end of the lane, a stop sign bent. Beyond that, the honest rectangle of pavement that led, by degrees and with placid indifference to my personal saga, toward town. On the way, I did the things a ranger does when moving from field to office, after a thing the office won't want to name. I checked my limbs for tics of the obvious sort. I kept my shoulders loose so I could still turn my head without making a scene. I thought of the logbooks and the rings and the tally posts, and the words that formed were not report words but liturgy. I kept them behind my teeth. At the clinic, men and women with the efficient gentleness of people who have touched every version of panic touched mine. Someone taped butterfly closures over the tear at my hairline. Someone else asked me if I wanted to talk to a chaplain and accepted. Not yet. Like it was a fine answer. A detective came and sat in a chair too small for his shoulders and slid a recorder across the table like he was handing me a cup of water. and not a responsibility. "Anything you can tell us," he said, and left everything else unsaid on the table between us. I gave him the edited version, true in bones if not in meat. The wall, the river, the structures, the sounds. I did not say faces, but I described the hands. I gave him coordinates where coordinates existed and bearings where they did not. He wrote it all down with a pen that clicked the same tempo as the posts in the wind. "Search?" he asked, when the paper had a tide line of ink halfway down. "You'll be tempted," I said. "You'll think it's disrespect not to, but you're not going to find what you think you're looking for. And you're going to give it a few more names to say. The math changes when you go in there." He looked at me with the hard eye of a man who has told too many parents there was nothing to bring home. "We still have to try," he said, and because decency is work in this world, I nodded and said I understood in the same tone. And the lie we both told together lived between us like an agreement to keep the town running. Weeks later, because time returned to behaving, I drove up alone to a pullout high enough to see a piece of the basin as a knitted green bowl and a piece of the ridge as a line of black supposed to be trees. I did not cross the gate. I sat on the hood with a thermos and watched weather think about forming. When I got back in, the passenger seat creaked with a weight that wasn't there. I didn't look, because good things can be scared away and bad things can be made braver by being seen. At home, when the house settled at 3 in the morning, I woke thinking I heard the small resiny peel of pads on wood. I lay flat and counted backwards. 31, 30, 29. Once, a week after that, I found a ring of river stones on my doorstep, each warm in the center like coins that had been held too long. I swept them into a bucket and tipped them back into the creek and felt, when the water closed over them, as if I had put something back where it belonged. You might want me to end with a rule, because rules are what we make when we don't understand a thing and want to live anyway. I have a few. Don't say yes when your own voice comes from the wrong direction. Don't walk toward a light that bleaches the bark, rather than lays on it. Don't make a circle in a place that is already nothing but circles. If you come to a ridge cut in notches, count them once and leave without giving the wood your hand. If you end up in Meadow Fork and the meadow decides it's a mouth, keep to water that remembers gravel and gravity, not hands. But I'm not giving you comfort. I can't. I'm writing this from a desk that has a pane of glass to its right, and the glass holds a view of cedars that have been here longer than the building. Sometimes, when the dishwasher knocks a pipe and the house hums in that particular pitch, the cedar tips all lean once the same way, as if something unseeable the size of a township has turned its head. Sometimes the radio on the counter says my name like I left it a debt. And last night, while I wrote down the names of those I could still bring myself to write, Eli, Samantha, Cole, and the rows that follow, the pen left a groove without ink, neat as a carved notch. And when I looked up, the shadow in the window had its head tipped like a listener deciding if the story had finally reached the part it was waiting for. I am a trained forest ranger. I know how to map a drainage and read a sky and talk a lost man out of the kind of grief that makes him walk in circles until his soles come off. I also know that somewhere out there, no, not out there, just under the thin skin of everything that looks like out there, something counts. It likes our edges. It likes the sound we make when we think we are alone and speak our names as if they were small. It likes when we carve tali in wood because we tell it with our patient hands that we understand the game. I will not give it my notch, not while I am awake to keep it. But when I sleep, it walks the perimeter of what I have left, dragging its pads lightly on the boards to mark where my little light fence begins and ends. I lie on my back and let breath leave slow and careful and speak to myself, steady and practical. Left foot, right foot. Look 3 steps ahead. Do not step into the circle, even if the circle is only a thought. And when the river rises in the dream, and the hands press up under it, I hold very still and wait for the current to remember itself. Because even in its worst moods, the water in this country knows downhill, and how to carry a man who asks for nothing but the chance to be set down on clean gravel again. If you go, which you shouldn't, which you will, take a name tied to your wrist with plain string, not your own. The name of a tree, the name of a river you miss. Tie it tight enough to leave an impression. When you hear your voice call from the wrong place, name the tree, name the river. Tell the world what it is before it tells you what you are. If you make it back, and you'll think the trick was yours. Walk the long way home, and do not count the telephone poles. When a child waves and shows you 5 fingers, wave back with your hand closed. And if, one day, you are cleaning out a drawer, and you find a patch with your department's crest, and the edges frayed into fringe, as if teeth have worried it for years, put it back. Close the drawer. Go outside. Stand where the light lies honest across the yard. Say nothing. Wait. Somewhere a ridge will breathe. Somewhere something will cock its head amused. It will think of rivers and of names. It will remember that it has 30, 1, 30, 2 if I am careless, and numbers are the only saints in this church that do not forgipple. I am telling you this because the telling is the one thing I have that does not belong to the trees. I am telling you because I wanted there to be a conclusion, and there isn't one. Only the long unraveling of a thread stretched from a stream with too many hands to a cabin with a logbook that writes itself, and to a town where a flag on a short pole will wrap itself around metal. Whenever the wind makes a mouth of the ridge, I will go back. Of course I will. Not because courage is a virtue, and not because I am paid to. Because a man who has been counted cannot sleep through the arithmetic. Because somewhere out there a boy stood with his palm open to show 5, and then went missing from the picture that declared him real. Because names set into trees are a poor gravestone, and if there is a way to carve anything different into the wood of this place, I mean to find it. Until then, when night falls with a swiftness that makes no sense for the season, I light the smallest flare I have and hold it angled down and away. The white core eats itself, and then the dark says give, and I do. I give it the part of the story that can be told and keep the rest in the part of me that has learned to be quiet. Because quiet is not surrender here. It's respect, and respect is the only rope I have found that will hold when the rest of the world turns to water. If you hear a laugh from the timber, and it sounds like yours, do not argue with it. That is a sermon designed for someone else. Walk to the river. Put your palm on a stone. Wait for the cold to steady. Count backwards until the numbers turn into the sound the water makes when it chooses to be exactly what it is, which is the only honest sound the forest offers a man it has noticed and spared. My name is Daniel Whittaker. I am 36 years old, recently divorced, and for the last 5 months, I have been trying to restart my life in a way that feels meaningful. I am not the sort of person who ever pictured himself moving into an old, isolated house, let alone one that carried such an unsettling reputation in town. But desperation and opportunity often arrive as twins, and the house that came into my hands was one I never expected to inherit through circumstance, or survive in with sanity intact. I purchased the property from my reclusive neighbor, a man named Henry Castor. He was 73 years old, wiry in frame, and always seemed as if the world itself was too loud for him. He lived 2 lots down from the modest rental, I had taken after leaving my marriage, tucked away in a crooked house that seemed both forgotten by time and strangely preserved against it. The paint peeled but never fell. The shutters clung on those storms battered them, and the roofline leaned at angles that seemed wrong to the human eye. Yet despite all that, the house stood, stubborn and unyielding. Henry was known in town as a recluse. He had groceries delivered, never drove into town, and when children biked past his lane, they whispered stories about him being a witch, a murderer, or something worse. Adults, of course, dismissed these tales, though they quietly warned each other not to get too close. "Xaster doesn't like visitors," they would say, lowering their voices. Best to leave him be. I would not have spoken to him at all, except one evening when I came home from work later than usual. I saw him standing at the end of my driveway. He looked thinner than ever, his shoulders trembling beneath a heavy wool coat, though the evening air was mild. His pale eyes fixed on me in a way that was both pleading and commanding. When I greeted him, he raised a hand and said in a voice dry as leaves, "You're Daniel Whitaker." "Yes," I said, startled that he knew my name. "You live alone?" It was not a question. "Yes," I admitted, a little unsettled. He gave a small, jerky nod. "Good, then you're the one. I want to sell my house." "To you." That was the beginning. The next few weeks unfolded strangely, as if I had been swept into someone else's dream. I learned that Henry had no surviving family, no friends, no ties of any kind that anyone in town could name. He handled everything himself, and, despite the rumors, had never broken a law. His decision to sell me the house came without negotiation. The price he asked was absurdly low, almost insulting for a property of its size. But when I questioned him, he simply said, "I need someone who will keep it. Not tear it down, not sell it on. You will keep it." I signed the papers less than a month later. The night before the closing, Henry came to see me again. This time he held a folded sheet of yellowing paper, creased so many times the edges had nearly torn away. He handed it to me with stiff, shaking fingers. "These are the things you must know," he whispered. His breath smelled faintly of iron and mold. "I don't care if you believe me. Just don't ignore them." The paper contained a list written in tight, slanted handwriting that was hard to read under the porch light. The words chilled me even before I understood them fully. 1. Do not stay in the cellar past midnight. 2. If you hear the upstairs door open after dark, lock your bedroom and wait until morning. 3. The third floor window must never be uncovered. 4. If you dream of the well, do not drink water the next day. 5. On the last night of winter, leave the attic light on until dawn. I looked up at him unnerved. Is this some kind of joke? Henry's face did not change. His eyes were wide, pupils too large, and his voice was like wind scraping through dead grass. "Do as it says, or the house will take you too." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away. His gait stiff and unsteady, his figure swallowed by the shadow of his own crooked roof. When the deal closed, Henry vanished. He did not stay to collect his things, or to ensure the money had cleared. His belongings were still inside the house, every piece of furniture coated in dust, every shelf lined with brittle books and cracked photographs of people I did not recognize. There were no forwarding addresses, no instructions, no explanation. I asked around town, but no one knew where he had gone. Maybe he went off to die somewhere, the clerk at the diner muttered. He always looked half a ghost anyway. I should have walked away then. Should have ignored the too cheap deal, the list of strange rules, the air of something rotten that clung to the place. But I was desperate. My marriage had ended in flames of bitterness. My savings were gutted, and the idea of owning a house, any house, felt like reclaiming a piece of stability. So I moved in. The first days were quiet enough. The house creaked constantly, but old wood tends to complain. The walls seemed to breathe with drafts, and the smell of damp earth lingered in every corner, but that too could be explained. I spent my time sorting through Henry's belongings, deciding what to keep, what to burn, what to simply drag to the edge of the property and leave for the junkman. It was during one of these cleaning sprees that I ventured into the cellar. The door was heavy, its hinges groaning as if they had not moved in years. The stairs were narrow, descending steeply into cool darkness. I carried a flashlight, and its beam fell on stacked jars, broken furniture, and stone walls slick with moisture. The air was thick with mildew, but beneath it I thought I caught another scent, faintly metallic, like rust or blood. At the far end of the cellar was a low stone arch. Beyond it lay a smaller chamber, circular and deeper than the rest. The walls here were carved with shallow lines, not random scratches but deliberate patterns. Circles, spirals, intersecting shapes that seemed to writhe when the light touched them. In the center was a round, stone, capped opening, the kind you might see in a medieval well. The cap was sealed with iron bands, though one had rusted through. I remembered the fourth rule on Henry's list: if you dream of the well, do not drink water the next day. My skin prickled. I closed the flashlight beam quickly and retreated, heart hammering. That night I locked my bedroom door. I told myself it was silly, that I was letting an old man's madness poison my thoughts. But around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps above me. Slow, dragging, deliberate. My breath caught in my chest. There was no one else in the house. I had not given anyone a key. Yet I heard the door to the upstairs hallway groan open, and then the steps came closer, stopping directly outside my bedroom. I clutched the blanket like a child, praying the lock would hold. The knob rattled once, twice, and stilled. After a long silence, the footsteps retreated. When dawn finally arrived, I opened the door to find the hall empty, the floorboards undisturbed, the air thick with a fable. Cold odor like extinguished candles. By the third day, I had begun to dread nightfall. I told myself I was tired, that stress and imagination made me hear things. But the house seemed alive with sounds no logic could explain. Whispers threaded through the vents, indistinct but urgent. A tapping came from behind the walls, in patterns too precise for rodents. And once, as I passed the covered third-floor window, I thought I saw the fabric ripple, as if something inside pressed against it, waiting. I considered moving out, even selling the house immediately, but the thought of returning to the cramped rental I had left behind, of admitting I had wasted my last savings, was unbearable. Pride chained me as tightly as fear, and part of me, though I hate to admit it, was curious. The rational part of my mind sought explanations. I told myself the list was superstition, the footsteps illusions, the whispers drafts. If I could catalog the strange events, explain them, I could conquer them. But explanations failed me on the 5th night. I woke again in the small hours, sweating and gasping from a dream I could not shake. I had been standing in the cellar, staring down into the sealed well. The iron bands were gone, the cap removed, and a black, glistening surface stared back. I leaned forward, and in the water I saw my own face. But it was not my reflection. Its lips moved on their own, forming words I could not hear, and its eyes were swollen, waterlogged, staring at me with a plea that curdled into malice. Then the hands rose from below, pale and clawing, reaching for my throat. I jolted awake, throat dry as sand, the taste of mildew in my mouth. I stumbled to the bathroom sink, turned the faucet, and let cold water gush into my cupped palms. But as I lifted it toward my lips, Henry's words echoed in my memory. If you dream of the well, do not drink water the next day. I froze. The water trembled in my hands, then spilled uselessly back into the basin. My thirst burned, but fear burned hotter. I left the sink running until the pipes groaned, as though to drown out the dream. When I finally shut it off, the silence that followed was worse. It was then I realized something else. The list was not a warning from a madman. It was a set of instructions, a survival guide, and I had only begun to test its edges. The morning after that dream left me unsteady. I walked through the house like a trespasser in my own home, every floorboard groan sounding like a rebuke. The list sat on my nightstand, the yellow paper even more brittle after a week in my possession. I unfolded it again, staring at the ink strokes that had etched themselves into my nerves. Do not stay in the cellar past midnight. Lock the bedroom if the upstairs door opens. The third floor window must never be uncovered. The words carried more weight now. I believed them. Or at least, I was terrified of testing them. Still, a strange thought grew in me. If Henry had written such rules, then he had lived here long enough to know them by heart, which meant he had endured these same horrors, night after night for decades. How had he lasted as long as he did? And why choose me, of all people, to inherit this burden? I did not go to work that day. I called in sick, something my employer had grown used to since the collapse of my marriage and the subsequent unraveling of my discipline. Instead, I prowled the house, determined to understand it more deeply. I started in the attic. The attic was surprisingly clean compared to the cellar, though dust coated everything in a faint gray film. Boxes stood stacked neatly against the slanted walls, their labels faded but legible. Winter clothes, Christmas ornaments, tax papers. At first glance, the place could have belonged to any elderly man too tired to climb stairs. But on the far wall, directly beneath the roof peak, a single light bulb hung from a cord. It was switched off, but I remembered the rule on the last night of winter: leave the attic light on until dawn. Why only then? What happened on that particular night? I reached up, gave the bulb a twist, and it flickered weakly to life. Its glow was dull and yellow, but it illuminated something odd: a series of scratches on the floorboards below. They weren't the haphazard claw marks of rodents. They were symmetrical, forming a wide ring around the bulb's shadow, almost as though something had circled the light repeatedly, unable to cross into its glow. I shivered and switched the bulb off. Descending from the attic, I wandered into Henry's study on the second floor. This room seemed different from the others. The shelves were lined not just with novels or histories, but journals, leather-bound volumes, each labeled with years 1989, 1991, 1994. Nearly every year had a book. They filled 2 shelves entirely. My pulse quickened as I pulled one free, the leather stiff but intact. Inside were Henry's entries, written in the same slanted hand as the list. The early pages chronicled mundane things: the weather, the garden, his health. But soon the entries darkened. March 12, 1992. Heard the upstairs door again. Stayed locked in my room. The scratching at the door lasted until dawn. April 3, 1992. Dreamed of the well. Could not drink all day. Terrible thirst, but I kept the rule. November 29, 1992. The window fabric stirred though no wind blew. Did not look. Will not look. The further I read, the less Henry seemed like a mad recluse, and more like a prisoner keeping records of his captor. My hands trembled as I flipped through the years, each entry repeating the same horrors I had begun to experience: footsteps, whispers, dreams, warnings, rules. One entry stood apart. Dated February 28, 2001. Last night of winter, tomorrow. Must remember light in attic. Always worse when I forget. Heard them in the walls for hours. Never again. I closed the book shaken and placed it back on the shelf. The room suddenly felt too crowded, as though the air itself pressed against me. I left, my nerves buzzing, and retreated downstairs. That evening I tried to distract myself with television, but every sound from the house drew my attention. By midnight, exhaustion pulled me to bed, but I left the list on the nightstand once more, as if its presence alone might shield me. I slept uneasily, every creak dragging me to the edge of waking. At some point in the dark hours, the sound came again, the groan of the upstairs door, the slow, deliberate steps. My body stiffened, every muscle taut with dread. I listened as the steps reached my door. The knob rattled. This time, instead of waiting, I pressed my ear against the wood. From the other side came a faint whisper. My name, not screamed or growled, but breathed, intimate and pleading. Daniel. I fell back, heart hammering. The lock held. The whisper came again, then silence. I did not sleep again that night. The next morning I discovered something new. On the floor outside my bedroom, the dust was disturbed, forming a perfect oval around the doorframe. Not footprints, not claw marks, just a smooth indentation, as though something without weight had pressed itself there. I backed away quickly, bile rising in my throat. That day, I began to drink more heavily than I had in years. Whiskey dulled the edge of my terror, though it did not erase it. By evening, emboldened or reckless, I decided to investigate the cellar again. The iron-banded well still sat in the circular chamber, its cap damp with condensation. I crouched beside it, running my hand along the rusting bands. To my shock, I felt a vibration. Very faint but rhythmic, like something shifting below. I pressed my ear to the stone. From the depths came a sound that could not be anything natural, a faint, wet whisper, almost like words rising through water. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and fled upstairs, bolting the cellar door behind me. That night, I did not sleep at all. I sat in the study, poring through Henry's journals one after another, desperate for answers. One passage struck me cold. September 6, 2005. They came closer last night, whispered my name. Sounded like my wife's voice, but she has been dead 20 years. Cannot trust them. Must never open the door. It was exactly what I had heard. My own name, spoken in a voice that was almost familiar. The thought chilled me more than anything else. These things, whatever they were, did not only know Henry, they knew me. The next few days blurred together. I avoided the cellar, avoided the third-floor window, and stared at the attic bulb as though it were a lifeline. I began marking time on a calendar, counting the days until the last night of winter, still weeks away. But each day brought new manifestations. The whispers grew louder, threading through the vents in the afternoon. Sometimes they seemed to laugh. Objects shifted places when I left a room. Once I returned to the kitchen to find every drawer pulled open, every utensil lined neatly on the counter. Then came the worst. On the 9th night in the house, I woke to silence so complete it roared in my ears. I sat up, sweating, sensing movement in the hallway. I reached for the lamp, but it would not turn on. The bulb was fine, the switch clicked, but no light came. Then, from the darkness of the hall, the knob turned slowly. This time, the lock clicked open. My throat closed in terror. I scrambled back across the bed, but before I could move further, the door eased inward. A draft like ice slid into the room, carrying with it the scent of wet stone. And then I saw it, a figure, half silhouetted in the dark. Tall, too tall, its head brushing the frame. Its arms hung at its sides. Hands elongated, fingers too many. It did not step in, it only leaned forward, face obscured in shadow, and whispered again, "Daniel." I froze. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body betrayed me. The figure waited. The air thickened. And then, without sound, the door slammed shut. The lock clicked again, sealing me in. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. When dawn finally came, I stumbled downstairs, determined to flee the house forever. But when I opened the front door, I faltered. The yard outside looked the same, the morning sunlight spilling across the trees. Yet something about it was wrong. The colors too vivid, the air too still. It felt like a painted backdrop rather than the real world. My stomach turned, and I shut the door quickly, retreating inside. That was when I understood the true nature of the trap. The house did not want me to leave. The following days only deepened that impression. Each attempt to step outside left me dizzy, disoriented, sometimes even waking hours later back in the bed I had tried to escape. I tested it twice more, with the same results. Whether by hallucination or manipulation, the house kept me inside. And the list, Henry's cursed list, remained my only guidance. On the 12th day, desperate for answers, I forced myself back into the cellar. This time, I brought one of Henry's journals, hoping for courage. I lit a lantern and set it on the damp stone floor, illuminating the strange carvings circling the well. In the journal, dated July 1998, Henry had written, "The marks are older than the house. Whoever built here knew. They are meant to bind it, but the binding weakens every year. Must never let the cap be removed." I stared at the well cap, at the rust eating away the iron bands. Weakening. Just as Henry had written, a sound rose from below, soft at first, then louder. A voice, not Henry's, not mine, but someone I recognized all the same, my ex-wife, Sarah. Distinct pleading. "Daniel, help me." I dropped the lantern in shock, its glass shattering, the flame sputtering out. Darkness swallowed the chamber. I scrambled blindly back up the stairs, slamming the cellar door behind me. That night, the dreams came harder. The well again, water rising, hands breaking the surface. Sarah's voice, begging me to listen, to look, to open. When I woke, my throat was so dry I could hardly swallow. Yet I did not dare drink. The house had learned my weakness. Sleep became a rare and fragile thing. Every time I closed my eyes, I was dragged back into the same images: the cellar, the well, the rising hands, and voices that knew me too well. Sometimes Sarah, sometimes my father, sometimes people whose voices I could not place yet somehow recognized with a bone, deep familiarity. They pleaded, mocked, cajoled. When I woke, the thirst was unbearable, but I forced myself to resist. Henry's warning had become scripture. On the 15th night in the house, something changed. The voices did not wait for sleep. I was sitting in the study, journal open on my lap, when I heard a whisper directly in my ear. I spun around, but the room was empty. The whisper came again, this time from the opposite corner, then from the ceiling, then from beneath the floor. Each whisper was different, yet all carried the same intent: open, open, open. I pressed my palms over my ears until they ached, rocking in the chair like a madman. When I removed them, the house was silent once more. But the silence was worse, a waiting silence, heavy and expectant. I went back to Henry's journals, desperate for guidance. I flipped through years at random until one entry struck me. March 3rd, 2010. They will try to trick you. They will sound like your family, your friends. Do not believe them. The house has their voices, not their souls. If you answer, you give them strength. My stomach clenched. I realized then that I had already answered, though only in dreams. My whispered replies, "Sarah, Dad," might have been enough. A terrible fear lodged itself in my gut. The days blurred after that. I stopped working entirely, stopped calling anyone. My phone lay dead on the kitchen counter, battery drained, and I did not bother charging it. I had no desire to speak with the outside world. Not because I thought they would not believe me, but because some part of me feared the voices would slip through the line and infect whoever I reached. Isolation became my only shield, though it felt less like protection and more like a slow burial. Around the 20th night, I tested the 3rd floor window. For weeks I had avoided it, keeping the heavy cloth draped across it as Henry had commanded. But curiosity, sharp and dangerous, ate at me. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking louder than the last, and stood before the covered frame. The cloth was heavy canvas, nailed at the corners. The edges fluttered slightly, though no wind stirred. I raised a hand, meaning only to brush the fabric, but as my fingers neared, the canvas bulged outward. Something pressed from the other side. Not a hand, not a face, but a shape that shifted like smoke under pressure. I stumbled back, heart racing, and the canvas rippled violently as though struck by unseen fists. A sound seeped through, a hiss, deep and guttural, filled with rage. I fled down the stairs 2 at a time, not daring to look back until I reached the ground floor. From below, I heard the pounding continue, rhythmic and insistent, like a beast demanding release. It lasted long into the night before fading into silence. The next morning, I found the nails at the corners of the canvas bent outward, the wood splintered. The thing behind the window had tried to claw its way inside. I hammered the cloth back tighter, hands shaking so badly I struck my fingers more than once. After that, I began to understand why Henry had survived so long. He had not fought the house, not really. He had endured it, obeyed its boundaries, lived by the rules as though they were sacred commandments. He had surrendered everything else. Family, community, even his sanity, to remain alive within its jaws. And when the years had stripped him bare, he had chosen me. Why me? The question gnawed at me daily. I thought back to the first time he spoke to me, how he had appeared at the end of my driveway without hesitation, declaring me the one. What did he see in me? Loneliness, desperation, some flaw that made me easier prey, or worse, some trait that made me suitable for what came next. The house did not wait for me to find the answer. On the 23rd night, I woke to the sound of water. It was a steady drip, 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 echoing through the air. I sat up confused and saw that the ceiling above my bed was soaked, water seeping through as though from a burst pipe. But the roof of the house was old, dry, brittle. There were no pipes above this room. The water fell faster, pooling on the floor, carrying with it a smell of rot and stagnant earth. I stumbled from the bed, splashing through the growing puddle, and realized the water was not falling randomly. It traced words across the plaster as it seeped down, letters forming one by one in wet, dark streaks. Well, I fled the room, slipping on the soaked boards, heart thundering. Behind me, the sound of dripping grew louder until it was a roar, as though an unseen river had burst through the ceiling. I locked myself in the study and sat trembling against the door until dawn. When I returned at sunrise, the room was dry. No puddles, no stains, no words. Only a faint damp smell lingering in the air. That day hunger gnawed at me. I had stopped eating properly days ago, surviving on stale crackers and sips of whiskey. But now my stomach ached, demanding more. I went to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and froze. Every item inside, Brelk, leftovers, was soaked in black water. The packages floated in it, bobbing gently as though in some unseen current. My throat seized at the sight. I slammed the door shut and backed away, hands trembling. The hunger did not ease, but the thought of touching any of it filled me with revulsion. I forced myself to go without, waiting for the feeling to dull into a hollow ache. By the 30th day in the house, I was nearly broken. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, my body weak from hunger and thirst, and yet the rules kept me alive. I had not stayed in the cellar past midnight. I had not uncovered the window. I had resisted the whispers, the water, the temptations. I had endured, but the last night of winter approached. Henry's words echoed in my mind. On the last night of winter, leave the attic light on until dawn. Always worse when I forget. I circled the date on the calendar, watching the days fall away until only one remained. Fear coiled in my stomach, sharper than ever. Whatever happened that night was the reason Henry had lasted, the reason he had written the rule. And now it was my turn. When the day arrived, I spent it pacing the house like a condemned man awaiting execution. Every window seemed darker, every shadow longer. I climbed to the attic before sunset, checking the bulb again and again, twisting it, tapping it, making sure it worked. The scratches on the floorboards seemed deeper than before, their circular pattern clearer in the dying light. At midnight, I sat cross-legged in the center of the ring, the bulb glowing weakly above me. The house groaned and shuddered around me, as though settling its weight for the night. At first, nothing happened. I began to wonder if it had all been paranoia, if the bulb's glow was merely symbolic. Then the scratching began. It came from the walls, from the roof, from beneath the floorboards. 1,000 claws raking at once, circling me in every direction. The bulb flickered, its light pulsing with each scrape. My breath came in shallow gasps. I clutched Henry's journal to my chest like a holy book, whispering nonsense prayers to no one. The scratches grew louder, faster, until they blended into a shriek. The floor trembled beneath me, the wood warping as though something beneath strained to burst through. The bulb flickered again, nearly dying, then blazed brighter than before. In its glow, I saw shapes pressed against the walls of the attic. Pale hands, twisted faces, bodies pressed flat as though the wood were only a thin veil. Their mouths opened in silent screams, their eyes glowing with hunger. They circled the ring, slamming against it, unable to cross into the light. The bulb's glow held them back, but I knew instinctively that if it failed, they would devour me. For hours they battered the barrier. The bulb flickered again and again, each time dimmer, until I was certain it would shatter. But at last, a gray dawn light seeped through the cracks in the roof, and the bulb's glow steadied. The figures faded, retreating into the walls like smoke dispersing. The scratching stopped. I collapsed, trembling, tears streaking my face. I had survived the last night of winter, but something in me had changed. When I descended the attic stairs, the house felt different. Quieter, almost welcoming. The air was lighter, the shadows less oppressive. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps I had passed some test, proven myself worthy to endure. Perhaps now the house would relent. I ate the last of the stale crackers, drank carefully from a bottle of whiskey, and allowed myself a few hours of dreamless sleep. But when I woke, the list was gone. I tore through the bedroom, then the study, then the entire house, searching every corner. The yellowed paper that had been my lifeline, my gospel, was nowhere to be found. In its place, lying neatly on my nightstand, was a new sheet of paper. The handwriting was the same, slanted and tight, but the words were different. 1. The well is opening. You must be ready. 2. When you hear the voice from the window, answer it. 3. The cellar is no longer safe. 4. Keep the attic dark. 5. You will know the rest when it is time. My blood ran cold as I read the lines. The rules had changed. The new list lay on my nightstand like a sentence written in advance. My hands shook as I read the words again, each one heavier than the last. The rules had changed. That alone was enough to unravel the fragile thread of control I had managed to keep. For weeks, the old list had been my only anchor, a set of commandments that kept me alive through horror. Now the anchor was gone, and I was adrift. The first line struck me hardest. The well is opening. You must be ready. I thought of the cellar, the rusting bands, the faint vibration I had felt through the cap. Ready for what? What could readiness mean when the very foundation of the house groaned with secrets too deep to fathom? The second line filled me with equal dread. When you hear the voice from the window, answer it. For weeks, I had obeyed Henry's warnings, never uncovering the third floor window, never acknowledging the sounds that seeped through the canvas. Now, this new directive demanded I do the opposite. The thought made bile rise in my throat. The rest was no better. The cellar, my place of discovery, was now forbidden. The attic light, once my shield, must now remain dark. And the final rule, You will know the rest when it is time was not a rule at all, but a sentence carved in ambiguity. I wanted to crumple the paper, burn it, reject it. But the memory of the first list stopped me. Henry had not been wrong. His rules had saved me more than once. If this new set of commands came from the same source, then I had no choice but to obey. For 2 days, nothing happened. The house seemed calmer, as though it had retreated to gather strength. I prowled through the rooms in silence, waiting for the inevitable. Hunger gnawed at me, thirst blistered my throat, but I resisted. The food in the fridge remained fouled with black water, and every time I turned the tap, the faint smell of rot rose from the sink. I ate dry oats from an old container, forcing them down raw, and sipped from the bottles of whiskey until each swallow burned more than it soothed. On the third night, the window called. It began with a faint tapping, like fingernails on glass. I froze in the hallway, staring up the staircase. The sound came again, rhythmic, deliberate. My hands shook as I climbed, every step dragging like lead. When I reached the 3rd floor, the canvas over the window pulsed gently, as though something pressed against it from outside. Then a voice seeped through. Not Sarah this time, not my father. This voice was my own. Daniel, it whispered, let me in, please, I can help you. My blood turned to ice. It was not merely mimicking people I loved. It was mimicking me. The words, the tone, even the cadence of breath. I staggered back, nearly tumbling down the stairs. But the new rule echoed in my head. When you hear the voice from the window, answer it. I licked my dry lips, trembling. What do you want? I whispered. The canvas shuddered. My voice answered, faint but clear. I want to show you the truth. Open the cloth. Just a corner. Enough to see. Every instinct screamed no. Yet the rule pressed on me, heavy as gravity. With shaking hands, I reached up and pried one nail loose from the corner of the canvas. The fabric fell back just an inch, exposing a sliver of glass. What I saw nearly drove me mad. It was night outside, yet not the night I knew. The world beyond the glass was black, the trees twisted into skeletal forms, the sky veined with red like cracked flesh, and there, pressed against the glass, was my own face. But not my reflection. It was me, grinning too wide, eyes swollen black, teeth long and sharp. The other, me pressed a hand to the glass, fingers boneless and writhing. Its mouth opened, and the voice, my voice, spilled out. We are waiting. The well is opening. You are chosen. I ripped the canvas back into place, driving the nail through with such force the wood splintered. The voice cut off immediately, replaced by a hiss that vibrated through the walls. I fled down the stairs, gasping, heart hammering. That night, I did not sleep. The whispers filled the house, circling, pressing, repeating the same phrase in dozens of voices. The well is opening. The well is opening. Over and over until my skull felt ready to crack. By morning, I could no longer deny it. The new rules were not guidance for survival. They were preparation for something worse, something final. I avoided the cellar, though I felt its pull with every passing hour. The floorboards above it seemed to vibrate faintly now like a drum beat. Sometimes I caught a faint draft rising from the gaps, damp and cold, smelling of earth and old stone. Once, I even thought I heard water dripping below, though the cap should have sealed it. The well was indeed opening. The attic became a place of terror. The light bulb, once my shield, now mocked me with its uselessness. I could not bring myself to turn it off, though the new list commanded it. Every night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, imagining what waited in the dark above me. Eventually, my cowardice won. I left the light on, clinging to its protection. If the new rules demanded I extinguish my only weapon, then perhaps I was doomed regardless. On the 35th day, something new happened. As I wandered the hallway, I heard a soft thud behind me. I turned and froze. There, On the floor, where nothing had been before, lay another sheet of paper. I picked it up with shaking hands. The writing was the same, but the words were fewer. You are almost ready. The door will open soon. No list of rules this time. No guidance. Just a promise, or a threat. That night the house began to shift. I do not know how else to describe it. The walls groaned, the floor tilted, the air thickened. It felt less like a house and more like a body, stretching, flexing, preparing. I clutched the journal I had been reading. Henry's words a small comfort, and whispered to myself over and over, survive, survive, survive. The window called again, but I did not answer. The whispers rose from the cellar, but I did not go. I broke every new rule, clinging desperately to the old ones. But the house seemed to know. It seemed to punish me. Around midnight, the lights in the entire house flickered out. Darkness swallowed everything. I stumbled through the rooms, searching for matches, candles, anything. My hand brushed against the wall, and to my horror, the wall pressed back. It bulged beneath my palm like skin stretched over muscle. I jerked back, gagging, and heard the faintest sound. Breathing. The house was breathing. I fled to my bedroom, barricaded the door with a chair, and sat trembling in the dark. The whispers rose again, but this time they were joined by footsteps, dozens of them, circling the room. I pressed my hands to my ears, but still I heard them, inside my skull. Chosen, they whispered, chosen. By dawn the noises faded, leaving me hollow. I slept in brief, restless snatches, waking each time to the sound of distant water. Always water. On the 36th day, I found the cellar door ajar. I had locked it days before, but the lock now hung broken, twisted as though by enormous force. A faint damp smell rose from below, stronger than ever. I stood staring for hours, paralyzed. At last, I forced myself to shut the door again, nailing it closed with trembling hands. But as I hammered, the wood vibrated beneath my blows, pulsing like a heartbeat. I knew then that my efforts were pointless. The house wanted the well open. It was only a matter of time. That evening, I returned to the study and pulled down one of the last journals I had not yet read. The entry on the final page stopped my breath. March 15, 2017. The house is not a house. It is a mouth. The well is its throat. I have kept it sealed as long as I could, but my strength is gone. When I die, it will need another. That is why I chose Daniel. He will last longer than me. I dropped the book, bile rising in my throat. The words confirmed what I had feared. Henry had not chosen me by chance. He had chosen me as a replacement. I was not a victim of bad luck, not a random inheritor. I was selected, groomed, delivered into the jaws of something older than stone. That night, the window voice returned one last time. My voice, clear and commanding. Daniel, it said, it is time. Open the well. I wept, rocking back and forth on the floor, clutching the journal. The rules, the whispers, the horrors, they had not been to protect me. They had been to shape me, to break me down, to mold me into the next keeper. The house was not only alive, it was hungry, and I was its caretaker now. I did not sleep the night after I read Henry's final journal entry. His words carved themselves into my mind, repeating over and over like a chant. The house is not a house. It is a mouth. The well is its throat. He had chosen me, not for kindness or mercy, but as a sacrifice. The realization did not shatter me, it hollowed me. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, barely noticing the walls pulsing, the whispers sharpening, the air thickening. It was as if the house no longer bothered to hide its nature. It no longer needed to. The morning of the 37th day brought a silence that terrified me more than any whisper or shadow. No footsteps, no voices, no scratching. Even the birds outside were absent, the air so still I wondered if time itself had stopped. I wandered from room to room, waiting, but the quiet persisted, pressing down until my ears rang. It felt like the pause before an executioner's blade. By dusk, I found myself at the cellar door again. The nails I had driven into it were bent outward, twisted like soft clay. The door hung slightly open, a damp draft spilling out, carrying the smell of earth and stagnant water. I knew then that resistance was over. The well was opening whether I wanted it or not. I descended with a lantern clutched in one hand, though the flame did little against the dark. Each step groaned under my weight, as though warning me to turn back. At the bottom, the chamber glistened with moisture. The carvings on the walls slick with condensation. The iron bands around the well cap were nearly corroded through, rust flaking away in wet chunks. And from beneath, I heard it clearly now breathing. Deep, slow, tidal. The sound filled the chamber, vibrating through the stone, rattling in my chest like a second heartbeat. I stumbled back, pressing against the wall, but the carvings burned cold against my spine. The breathing grew louder, shifting into words, dozens of voices at once, overlapping and layered. Daniel, Daniel, Daniel. I clutched my ears, but the voices were inside me. They were not speaking to my body. They were speaking to the marrow of my bones. And then, with a groan like mountains splitting, one of the iron bands snapped. The well cap shifted, lifting slightly, water seeping through the crack. The black liquid glistened in the lantern light, and a stench rolled out that nearly made me retch. Hands rose from the gap. Pale, thin, clawed fingers grasped the stone, pulling. The cap slid further aside, another band breaking with a shriek of rust. Water sloshed, spilling over, but it was not water, not entirely. It wreathed, thick and dark, moving with a life of its own. Faces appeared in it, human and not, their mouths open in silent screams before dissolving again. I screamed, the first real scream since this nightmare began, and fled up the stairs. Behind me, the cellar thundered as if something massive shifted in its depths. I slammed the door shut, but it did not matter. The sound carried through the floorboards, the whole house vibrating with the rhythm of the thing's rise. The rest of the night blurred into madness. The walls warped, bulging inward, as though something enormous pressed from the other side. The floors pulsed wetly, and black water seeped up through the cracks, pooling in the rooms. Every mirror in the house cracked simultaneously, shards spilling across the floors, each fragment reflecting not my face, but dozens of others twisted, decayed, grinning. The voices no longer whispered, they screamed. They called my name in unison, demanding, commanding, exalting. Daniel, open. Daniel, chosen. Daniel, now. I fled to the attic, the only place that felt remotely safe. I clung to the light bulb cord, flicking it on, though the new rules had told me to keep it dark. The glow filled the space weakly, but enough to push back the shadows. The scratches on the floorboards were fresh now, gouged deep, circling me in tight spirals. As I sat trembling in the center, I realized the house had herded me here. This was not refuge. This was ritual. Hours passed. I lost track of time. The light flickered, steadied, flickered again. Below, the sound of rushing water grew louder, as if the well had erupted into a river. At some point, exhaustion claimed me, and I slipped into a fevered dream. I stood at the mouth of the well, but it was no longer in the cellar. It yawned in the center of the world, vast and endless, the earth around it crumbling into darkness. Shapes rose from its depths, countless figures writhing in black water, their faces familiar and strange. My ex-wife Sarah, my father, people I had known in childhood, even Henry, his pale eyes wide with terror. They reached for me, their mouths open, voices layered together in a single command, jump. I awoke with a scream, sweat soaking my clothes, throat raw. The bulb above me flickered violently, buzzing like an insect caught in glass. And then it went out. The darkness that filled the attic was not ordinary. It was heavy, textured, alive. I heard movement all around me, claws scraping, bodies pressing, mouths opening. Dozens, hundreds. They circled, pressed against me, yet did not touch. They were waiting. The lantern flickered to life on its own, though I had not touched it. Its weak glow illuminated the paper lying on the floor before me. A new message, written in the same tight slanted hand. Now you understand. The mouth must feed. The air split with a roar and the house convulsed. The floor cracked, the walls bowed. The ceiling split. Black water gushed upward, flooding the attic, dragging me toward the center of the spiral of scratches. I fought, clawing at the boards, but the water carried me, cold and thick, filling my mouth, my lungs. I was pulled downward through the floor, through the house, into the cellar. The well cap was gone now, shattered stone floating like driftwood in the flood. The throat gaped wide, swallowing everything. Faces pressed against mine, hands grasping, pulling me deeper. I tried to scream, but only bubbles spilled out. In that moment, I saw it clearly. The house was only the surface, the mask. Beneath it lay the true thing, vast and incomprehensible, older than any stone foundation. A mouth that spanned beyond the earth, a hunger that no amount of flesh or soul could satisfy. And I, Daniel Whittaker, was not its victim. I was its servant. I remembered Henry's words. I have kept it sealed as long as I could. When I die, it will need another. That was the truth. The house did not kill its chosen. It kept them, twisted them, made them its keepers. Not to escape, but to endure. To pass on the burden, generation after generation. Each one feeding it just enough to keep it sated but not full. The black water closed over my head. My lungs burned, my body convulsed, and then, impossibly, I breathed. The liquid filled me, searing my chest, but it did not drown me. It became me. My vision blurred, then sharpened again, the darkness alive with shapes. They surrounded me. The keepers before me, their eyes hollow, their mouths whispering in unison. Welcome, Daniel. I do not know how long I drifted there, suspended in the well's throat, watching faces rise and dissolve in the current. Days, months, years, it no longer mattered. Time had no meaning, hunger was all. And when I finally opened my mouth, I found I could speak with the others, my voice merging with theirs into the chorus. The house above waits now, quiet, patient. To any who pass, it looks abandoned, leaning. Just another relic of a forgotten man. But inside it breathes, it waits. And I wait with it. The list lies ready for the next one.